He had 3 casinos down there until Castro sent him home. His people know how to be discreet. With the right encouragement, he could help. And he's very patriotic.
Jimmy, Mr. Carlson.
Tina, the kids.
All right, come on, kids. Come on. Go on the beach. Let's go. Here, bring it.
Oh, please.
Sit down. Some water, some coffee, whatever.
Is there someplace else we could go?
All right, Daddy, we're going down to the beach. We'll be back in a while.
Make sure they don't go into the water unless somebody's watching them.
No, I'm gonna let them drown.
Make sure they put their shoes on. They'll burn their feet.
Yeah, we're getting their shoes. All right, come on. Let's go.
So what do you want to talk to me about?
The government's about to deport you for certain activities.
I'm in this country since I'm 2 months old. Does that make me Italian? I'm American. And they're trying to send me back?
I could have the deportation order reviewed. Have you classified as highly sensitive for national security? I could take the government off your back if you can help us.
Usually the guys that scare me. You're the people that make big wars.
No, we make sure the wars are small ones, Mr. Palm.
Let me ask you something. We Italians, we got our families and we got the church. The Irish, they have the homeland. The Jews, their tradition. Even the niggers, they got their music. What about you people, Mr. Carlson? What do you have?
The United States of America. The rest of you are just visiting.
The president wants the noise level on the operation.
It started as a Cold War contingency plan, a hidden army forged in the shadows by the Central Intelligence Agency. If the Soviets ever rolled tanks into Western Europe, there would be resistance, trained, armed, and ready. It was called Operation Gladio. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it stretched across an entire continent. The veil came off in the Italian Senate. Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti dropped the name, Gladio, and with it, a flood of questions. Within days, officials across Europe admitted what had long been whispered. There had been similar networks operating in Belgium, France, West Germany, the Netherlands, and even neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. Some had been disbanded quietly. Others, it seemed, were still active. According to the German newspaper Die Welt, by 1959, the entire network was up and running. Weapons caches were buried across the countryside. Hundreds of operatives, trained in sabotage and guerrilla warfare, were put on standby, waiting for the day the Soviets might march in. A Belgian intelligence officer admitted there had been at least 6 caches in his country, until 2 months ago. A former Dutch defense minister confirmed the same. In Greece, they called the program Sheepskin. In France, it ended only after the Italians blew the lid off. Andreotti told his parliament that Gladio had more than 600 men on the payroll at its peak. Even now, after scaling down, it hadn't completely vanished. The plan, from the beginning, was to bury weapons in depots across Italy, 139 of them. Most were dismantled in 1973. But 12 went unaccounted for. Gladio might have stayed buried forever, if not for a murder case. A Venetian magistrate, Felice Casson, was digging into a 1972 car bombing that killed 3 police officers in Gorizia. The explosives, it turned out, came from one of Gladio's hidden arsenals. The bomber was a neo-fascist named Vincenzo Vinciguerra, sentenced to life. But the bigger story was in the weapons themselves. Casson, along with fellow magistrate Carlo Mastelloni, was now chasing the link between Gladio and a string of right-wing bombings that rattled Italy in the 1970s and early 80s. In Washington, a US government official tried to distance America from it all. "It's an Italian operation," he said. "We have no control over it whatsoever." But nobody believed that, not after former CIA Director William Colby went on Italian television and casually admitted the US role. Colby had helped build the network, starting in 1951, when he was sent to Stockholm to set up a similar system in Scandinavia. He also confirmed what many Italians had long suspected, that the CIA funneled money into Italy's Christian Democrats and other anti-communist parties to keep the left out of power. So Italy wouldn't fall into communist hands, Colby said. But this wasn't just covert operations and cash in envelopes. Civilians were involved too. One of them, a businessman from Verona named Roberto Cavallaro, said he was recruited after taking part in anti-Soviet demonstrations. He got 700,000 lire a month, about $635, delivered in a yellow envelope by intelligence officers. His job? In the event of a communist takeover, it stirs up chaos. He walked away in 1973 after hearing of a planned hit on 2 former communists. The job was cancelled. He left. Meanwhile, a different war had already started. When the Second World War ended, the bombs stopped, the tanks went quiet, and the headlines called it peace. But peace was a headline, not reality. Behind the scenes, a new game had already begun. The old fascists had lost the war, but the real enemies, socialists and communists, had just become the next threat. In public, the West had allied with the Soviet Union to beat the Nazis. The Red Army was painted as a savior in newspapers from New York to London. But the truth was uglier. The elites in Washington and London hated the communists even more than they hated the Nazis. They tolerated Stalin because they had to. Britain was bleeding. France was broken. Italy was on its knees. The Soviet Union was the only thing holding back Hitler's final push. And so, for a moment, everyone played nicely. But as soon as the guns went silent, the narrative flipped. The Cold War wasn't born. It was unveiled. Europe, devastated and leaning left, became a battlefield all over again. America didn't want to rebuild it out of goodwill. It wanted leverage. Harry Truman saw it. So did Eisenhower. So did Nixon and Kennedy. Financial aid became the leash. The Marshall Plan wasn't just about food and factories. It was about control. The United States became the world's new empire, but not through tanks. This time, it was done with money and intelligence agencies, loans, reconstruction, and military bases. The Europeans, many of them democratically elected socialists, didn't want it. They saw the strings, but they were broken, and America was too big to say no to. Winston Churchill, ever the colonialist, hated the Russians. After the war, he begged Truman to keep fighting, this time against the Soviets. But Roosevelt had been different. He sympathized with the workers. His wife, Eleanor, had known more than a few communists personally. For a moment, America didn't see the Soviet Union as the villain. That changed with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The nuclear arms race was on. Stalin wanted a bomb of his own. Washington wanted Europe. And neither was willing to blink. And so, a new alliance was born, one nobody voted for. The CIA needed foot soldiers, muscle, and influence. Organized crime had all three. What began as an informal relationship during the war evolved into a partnership. 10 years later, it would become something far bigger than anyone had imagined. A cross-continental network of gangsters, spies, fixers, and killers, with ties stretching from Washington to Tel Aviv, from Rome to Havana. It was about stopping socialism, yes, but it was also about money, power, silence, and it wasn't going away. When John Kennedy was gunned down in Dallas, it felt less like a tragedy and more like a message. A public execution in broad daylight, caught on camera, witnessed by millions, and the country stood still. For a moment, America clung to the idea that it was just a lone gunman, a drifter with a rifle, a madman with a grudge. Then Jack Ruby walked into the basement of the Dallas police station and calmly shot Lee Harvey Oswald in the gut. That illusion shattered. In Louisiana, they didn't need the evening news to explain it. They knew Oswald. They knew Ferry. They knew what it meant. This wasn't random. It wasn't personal. It was a coup, planned, approved, and carried out by professionals, by men who made a living operating in the dark, men who knew how to eliminate a problem before it became a threat. Political assassinations don't happen in a vacuum. They're authorized by real power, the kind that doesn't run for office but funds the people who do, the kind that doesn't sit for interviews but owns the stations. The Mafia wasn't on the sidelines of this story. They were in the center of it. And nowhere were they more entrenched than in New Orleans. This documentary is about those men, the ones who turned the New Orleans underworld into a global empire. They inherited the Southern criminal pipeline in the 1940s and 1950s and built something that could rival New York and Chicago combined. They were silent partners in legitimate industries, quiet influencers in foreign coups, and landlords of entire governments. Since the 1880s, New Orleans hadn't just been a port city. It had been a capital, a staging ground. The Lucchese, Genovese, and Profaci families all ran operations that reached the Gulf. But the men in New Orleans weren't just connected to the five families. They were the foundation beneath them. And when Robert Kennedy came after them, he didn't realize he was pulling the pin on the grenade that would destroy his own brother. These men didn't just run rackets, they ran trade. Even the most basic things on your dinner table came with a backstory soaked in corruption. Take the banana. In 1929, the United Fruit Company was collapsing. It was saved not by banks, but by mob money and muscle. Its founder, with underworld backing, stormed back into the boardroom and took the company over by force. Within a decade, United Fruit controlled nearly half of Guatemala. Not just land, leaders, elections, laws. They didn't lobby governments, they owned them. And when owning wasn't enough, they replaced them. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Brazil, Cuba, the Dominican Republic. All became satellites in an expanding orbit of influence. And from that blood and bribery arrangement came a phrase that summed it all up: Banana Republic. But that phrase wasn't invented in a boardroom. It was born in the streets, in the ports, on the docks. A banana republic was a country entirely dependent on one agricultural product, vulnerable to collapse if that product stopped moving. Banana court meant the judicial system could be bought, sold, or rigged. No honest judge could ever stand against the people who wrote the paychecks. And straight off the banana boat became slang for smuggling, drugs, weapons, even people, hidden in plain sight, greased by mob-controlled shipping routes and customs officials who knew better than to ask questions. These weren't metaphors. They were standard operating procedure. And when the CIA needed muscle for its foreign policy experiments, they didn't look to the Pentagon. They looked to New Orleans. They needed deniability. The mob needed leverage. Together they moved heroin, guns, cash, and people across oceans and borders, toppling regimes and replacing them with friendly dictators. Every coup had a price. Every shipment had a purpose. And every silence was paid for in advance. What you're about to see is just the beginning of a much larger story about how the underworld and the government found common ground in global corruption. A story about the men who helped take down the Kennedy administration and reshape American power from the inside out. This isn't the full picture. Not yet. This is just the smoke before the fire. The breadcrumb trail back to the seeds of our past. Seeds planted in blood, money and silence and grown into the world we're living in today. These men didn't just do coups d'etats, they lived them. It was in their DNA. Blood in, blood out. Trying to separate them from their money was like diving into a pit of knives. You bled out before you ever hit the bottom. The New Orleans Mafia wasn't just some street gang running nickel and dime rackets. It was a machine embedded in the American bloodstream, connected to some of the biggest corporations this country had ever seen. When the New Orleans operation started to crack, It wasn't the capos or soldiers who got clipped. Most of them weren't even touched. The only boss who fell was Carlos Marcello, and even that was temporary. In the 1980s, he was pulled out of the fire by a quiet favor from another president, George Bush, who at the time was preparing to take the Republican reins from Reagan. The truth was, the New Orleans Mafia didn't just play politics, they helped make presidents. They controlled logistics, moved product, especially perishables, across the country with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. After Prohibition, they didn't fade away. They evolved. They monopolized shipping lanes, trucking routes, and warehousing. They weren't just connected to cities like Chicago, New York, or Boston. They were in the veins of American industry. One of their biggest corporate ties was with the United Fruit Company, which had deep roots going back to Silver Dollar Sam, Silvestro Carollo. They called it the octopus because its reach was that long, that deadly. The United Fruit Company was more than just bananas. It was a shadow empire. It reshaped economies, rewrote laws, and ran governments from behind the curtain. In Guatemala alone, it owned 42% of the country and more than 3.5 million acres across Central America and the Caribbean. On the surface, it was a marketing success story, a sanitized travel brochure fantasy where tourists were whisked through plantations like they were visiting paradise. But behind the curtain, it was something else entirely. The name United Fruit became synonymous with corruption, political manipulation, and corporate violence on a scale that still makes historians flinch. The company mastered divide and conquer. It ran plantations like pre-Civil War slave fields. It backed military coups and financed bloodshed, all while convincing the US government that it was defending democracy. In reality, it was protecting bananas and bottom lines. In the 1950s, when Guatemala's democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz tried to reclaim land from United Fruit, the company launched a full-scale propaganda war. It sold the idea that Arbenz was a Soviet pawn, too close to American shores. Washington bit. The CIA got the green light. The operation, scripted by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a rabid anti-communist who, conveniently, had once been a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that handled United Fruit's business. His brother, Alan Dulles, just so happened to be head of the CIA. He too had commercial ties to United Fruit. These weren't coincidences. They were chess moves. And like everything else in that era, the moves were backed by muscle. Real muscle. The kind that came from New Orleans. The CIA needed distribution networks, smugglers, fixers, and brokers who knew how to move guns and money across borders. And they already had them. The network had been operating for years in Louisiana, quiet and efficient, protected by judges and congressmen who knew how to look the other way. By the 1950s, the coups weren't just in Guatemala. They were everywhere. And someone had to arm the rebels. Someone had to fly the planes. Someone had to grease the right hands. That someone was often a mafia-connected broker working in tandem with intelligence agents. It wasn't just United Fruit. It was big oil, real estate, gambling, and every one of them had skin in the game and debts to people who didn't forget. From the top of the US government to the bottom of the banana fields, the entire episode reeked. And the marketing arm of the operation. It was just as slick, just as calculated. United Fruit had mastered public relations. One of its boldest moves came through its private shipping line, the Great White Fleet. On paper, the fleet moved bananas from Central America to American supermarkets. In practice, it was a floating billboard for United Fruit's brand of tropical imperialism. By the 1930s, the Great White Fleet wasn't just carrying fruit. It was carrying tourists, middle-class Americans, looking to escape grey northern winters for something warm and exotic. Ads promised luxury cruises, pristine beaches, smiling locals, and perfectly manicured plantations. The company sold the illusion of paradise, right down to curated tours of its own facilities. Tourists saw hand-picked sections of fields, spotless packing plants, and workers who had been coached to smile on cue. What they didn't see were the strikebreakers, the poverty, or the brutal working conditions. That was kept out of frame. Behind the curtain, the company was shifting its gaze to something else, something organized crime had already figured out. Gambling on the water. The Southern Mafia had been running games on converted canal boats and yachts for years, slipping just outside the 3-mile territorial limit to avoid the law. These floating casinos were untouchable, offshore, unregulated, and immensely profitable. United Fruit took notice. That's when names like Silvestro Carollo, Joe Adonis, Carlo Gambino, Galliano, Lucchese, as well as Frank Costello, started to show up in conversations. New Orleans figures, men with roots in the docks and backrooms, came into the picture. Meyer Lansky was pulled in. The Bahamas were opened up, so was the Dominican Republic. Guatemala became more than a fruit basket. It became a port of vice. Tourism exploded. But the tourists weren't just headed to beaches. They were funneled, intentionally, into hotels, restaurants and casinos controlled by the mob. From the boat to the bed, every dollar changed hands with someone on the payroll. By the 1940s and 1950s, organized crime had a stranglehold on the entire industry. They ran the ferries, the hotel chains, and the entertainment venues. The docks, too. The ports were mob turf. Nassau became a haven for the Corsican Mafia, the New Orleans Mafia, the New York Mafia, old rum runners and new millionaires. A quiet place to park money, or launder it. Bimini, even closer to Florida, served as a launch pad for booze during Prohibition, and later as a gambling escape. Havana, already notorious in the 1920s, turned into the Caribbean's capital of vice, with casinos like the Tropicana, Hotel Nacional, and Sans Souci pumping cash straight into mafia pipelines. Figures like Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Santo Trafficante didn't just visit, they ran the show. Back in the States, cities like Atlantic City and Hot Springs operated under a similar playbook: gambling, vice, and silence, protected by local governments. Saratoga Springs blended horse racing with syndicate cash. New Orleans was its own beast, a port city where Carlos Marcello rose to power with the same strategy: own the docks, control the flow. Palm Island, in Florida, became a retreat for men like Al Capone, who moved in with property deeds and political connections. So, when United Fruit's ships dropped anchor at places like Guatemala, what the tourists didn't realize was that their trip had been scripted. They were walking into hotels, casinos, and dining rooms where every linen, every menu, every dollar spent was tied to organized crime. This wasn't a coincidence. It was business. The mob wasn't a hired hand. They were equal partners. By the late 1920s, the truth about life on the United Fruit Company's plantations was starting to boil over. Workers endured brutal conditions, long hours, starvation wages, and housing that barely qualified as shelter. There was no path to improvement, no promise of better days. Just heat, debt, and silence. That silence broke when over 32,000 workers across Colombia walked off the job, demanding basic rights: a 6-day work week, 8-hour shifts, and a raise. The company didn't flinch. Instead, it painted the strike as a national threat, claiming the workers had been infiltrated by communist agitators. Then came December 6, 1928. In the town square of Ciénaga, the Colombian army surrounded the striking workers and their families, unarmed and assembled peacefully. General Carlos Cortés Vargas, backed by pressure from United Fruit, ordered the attack. The army opened fire. Some reports claim 100 dead. Others say it was closer to 2,000. The number didn't matter. The message did: cross the company and you get erased. Gabriel Garcia Marquez captured the horror in 100 Years of Solitude, immortalizing the bloodshed. But art was the only justice. On the ground, nothing changed. The United Fruit Company continued operations as usual, same low wages, same toxic labor conditions. When strikes flared up again in Costa Rica, the company refused to negotiate until the government stepped in to mediate. The result was rare. Workers secured better wages and more accurate weighing practices. But it was a crack in the armor, not a collapse. Meanwhile, the company's expansion across Central America came at a high environmental cost. Tropical rainforests were razed by the acre to make room for banana plantations. Monoculture farming replaced entire ecosystems, wiping out biodiversity and opening the door to pests and disease. To compensate, United Fruit dumped tons of chemical pesticides and fertilizers into the soil. DBCP, one of the worst, was sprayed without restraint, even though the health risks were well known. Workers exposed to it developed cancers, kidney failure, and reproductive damage. The land wasn't just poisoned, it was re-engineered. Rivers were diverted to keep the plantations watered, draining local communities and sparking conflict over access to basic resources. The United Fruit Company wasn't just damaging lives. It was reshaping the physical geography of Central America to serve its bottom line. In Honduras, the company played the long game. It bought up land, millions of acres of the most fertile soil in the region, at bargain prices from a desperate government. Then it bought influence. Politicians were bribed. Campaigns were funded. Laws that might threaten United Fruit's hold on the economy were buried before they ever reached a vote. In some cases, the company didn't even need to lobby. It had a veto. Infrastructure followed, but only where it served corporate needs. Railroads and ports were built, but strictly for banana transport. Public works that didn't align with the company's logistics were ignored. Honduras wasn't developing. It was being colonized, one shipping crate at a time. By the 1970s, countries like Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama tried to push back. They formed a coalition to demand better terms for their banana exports, a bigger piece of the profits they generated. United Fruit, now renamed United Brands, refused. Then, in 1975, the whole thing blew wide open. The Securities and Exchange Commission uncovered a bribe, over $1 million paid by United Brands to a senior Honduran official to slash the banana export tax in half. The move would have saved the company millions. The fallout was immediately. Eli Black, the company's president and CEO, jumped to his death from the 44th floor of the Pan Am building in New York. His suicide kicked off a federal inquiry that pulled back the curtain on how deeply United Brands had embedded itself into the politics of Central America. The scandal, quickly dubbed Bananagate, exposed just how far corporations were willing to go to control foreign governments. But behind every corporate move was muscle. When Silver Dollar Sam was deported, the company needed someone to take the reins in New Orleans. That man was Carlos Marcello. He already had the lobbyists, the political fixers, the Washington connections. What people miss about organized crime is that it was never just about the money. Guys like Luciano, Costello, Lansky, Gambino, Marcello, Genovese, they didn't just rake in cash, they reinvested. Every dollar went back into the American economy, through shipping, construction, real estate, unions, and gambling. They built cities. They funded growth. But they didn't pay taxes, and the price of that was bribery. Politicians knew these guys were on the front page. They wanted a cut for the risk. The mob used unions to wash the money, used companies to make it all look clean. The real magic wasn't in the crime. It was in making the crime look like business. At the center of that bridge between Washington and the underworld stood Irving Davidson. He wasn't a gangster. He was something worse, an operator, a bagman for foreign dictators, mob bosses, and corporate moguls, a lobbyist with his hands in everything. He was Carlos Marcello's closest link to the nation's capital, trusted, untouchable. He didn't just open doors, he controlled the room once you walked in. The men behind the United Fruit Company weren't just corporate strategists or shipping magnates. They were part of one of the oldest, quietest criminal syndicates in American history. The New Orleans Mafia had built its power by staying quiet and staying close to commerce. And in their shadow stood figures like Philip Bucola, known to his men as Filippo, the Sicilian-born boss who laid the groundwork for what would become the New England crime family. Bucola was more than just a racketeer. He controlled boxing, real muscle. He had the kind of men who didn't talk, didn't flinch, and knew how to move cargo without drawing attention. Most of them worked the docks, Boston, Springfield, Providence, bringing them into alignment with Meyer Lansky's web, Mike Miranda's streetwise operations, and a growing network that spread from Massachusetts down to Louisiana, with Silvestro Carollo in New Orleans and Sam Zamuri pushing millions of stems of bananas through Central American ports. A convergence began. One built not on bloodshed, but on logistics. Zamuri, the man they called Sam the Banana Man, had built his empire through brute force and political muscle. The Cuyamel Fruit Company had no mom-and-pop operation. He financed revolutions in Honduras and bought influence in Washington. When United Fruit absorbed Cuyamel, it wasn't a merger, it was a threat containment. But Zamuri wasn't done. When United Fruit floundered in the Depression, he stormed back, proxies in hand, and took over the company he once sold. From that point forward, he was the whole show. The plantations, the shipping fleets, the trade routes, they were his. Carollo knew how to make use of that. A fixer, a liaison between Sicilian Old World Order and American chaos, Carollo's connections stretched from New Orleans to Guatemala. Sam Zamuri needed the docks to run smoothly, and Carollo made sure of it. He kept the longshoremen in line, the customs agents quiet, and the bananas flowing. And when Carlos Marcello needed to make his way back into the United States after being dumped in Guatemala, it wasn't a lawyer or a diplomat who helped. It was the same pipeline that had been moving fruit, money, and muscle for decades. The same people who had made fortunes off bananas could make paperwork disappear. Philip Bucola fit into this world seamlessly. Born in Palermo, he came to the United States at 32 and quickly established himself as a boss. When Gaspare Messina stepped aside, Bucola took control of the Boston rackets and brought a level of discipline the street hadn't seen. His underboss, Joe Lombardo, helped keep operations steady, while Bucola built real power, boxing contracts, gambling, and unions. It wasn't all underground. He filed litigation over tax penalties. He represented boxers arriving from Europe. His name showed up in sports pages and Senate hearings alike. When the heat got too strong in 1954, Bucola stepped down and passed the reins to Raymond Patriarca, tight-lipped, lethal, and respected. The name of the family changed, but the business didn't miss a beat. The Senate knew where the power was. Kefauver's crime hearings dragged Bucola, Patriarca, and Worcester's Frank Iacone into the national spotlight. But it was already too late. These men weren't hiding in the shadows. They were inside the system. They had the ports, the unions, the courts, and the politicians. While the headlines focused on narcotics or murder, the real empire moved cargo, bananas, guns, and people. Sam Zamuri, meanwhile, had turned United Fruit into a global operation, running ships under foreign flags to dodge taxes, financing coups, and spreading his influence across Central America with the backing of US troops. He didn't need a title. He had the stock. When Wall Street doubted the company, Zamore simply walked into the boardroom with mob money and muscle and took it. He fired dead weight and handed out power to the men who produced, not the ones who graduated Ivy League. He didn't care how you looked. He cared if you could move fruit. He was a businessman, but one cut from the same cloth as Carollo and Marcello. When it suited him, he used the US military like it was private security. When it didn't, he sailed his ships under foreign colors to skip out on taxes. And when he wanted to get something or someone into the country, he called on the same network that kept the docks of New Orleans humming. This wasn't about bananas, it was about control. By 1940, Sam Zamore wasn't just running bananas, he was running influence. The American Progress called him Don Sam, but that wasn't an exaggeration. Zamore had so much pull in New Orleans that he could crack the whip over entire newspapers. And he did. When Jim Thompson, the battered publisher of the New Orleans Item, hesitated to back Sam Jones in the upcoming gubernatorial race, Zamore stepped in and made the decision for him. The press was his. The agenda was his. And the candidate? Sam Jones, hand-picked, paid for and packaged to crush the very laws that gave working-class voters a voice. Zamore had a personal reason for backing Jones. The free poll tax. He hated it. So did his son. The very first move the younger Zamore and Marshall Ballard Jr. made when they formed their political league was a public attack on that law. They didn't want workers, poor folks, or immigrants voting for candidates like Huey Long. They wanted to roll the system back to the days when only the landowners had a say, men like Zamore. Huey Long had called him out years earlier. Back in 1930, Long put out a circular exposing what was hiding beneath the glossy banana empire. He told voters exactly who Zamore was: a man who bought governments in Central America, a man whose fortune was built with the backing of US soldiers bleeding out in jungle revolutions they were never told about. Long didn't sugarcoat it. Zamore used the US military like a private army. Every time a president in Honduras or Nicaragua got in the way, he was replaced. And every time Zamore staked a new claim, the Marines made sure it stuck. Zamore wasn't hiding any of it. In fact, he leaned into it. He had risen from a banana peddler with a freight car in Alabama to the head of the most powerful fruit monopoly in the Western Hemisphere. By the time the Great Depression hit, he was already a multimillionaire with estates in Tangipahoa Parish, a fleet of ships, and a direct pipeline into Washington. When United Fruit faltered in 1932, Zamore walked into the Boston boardroom with a stack of stockholder proxies and took over the company like a hostile takeover out of a gangster novel. He wasn't voted in. He seized control. By 1938, he had the title of president, but it was just paperwork. Zamore was already in charge. He dictated policy. He handled foreign negotiations. He decided how United Fruit's web of railroads, steamships, plantations, radio stations and commissaries operated from Guatemala to Jamaica. And he did it like a man raised on the docks, not in a boardroom. He didn't care if his executives drank or gambled or ran side operations. He wanted results. That made him a natural partner for men like Silvestro Carollo, who could move dock workers and law enforcement like chess pieces, and Carlos Marcello, who was becoming the most powerful man in New Orleans by following the same script. Keep your hands dirty and your name clean. The same year Zamore crushed United Fruit's old guard, he was also leveraging his clout in local politics. Through the press, through cash, through backdoor deals, he steered the system. And while the Times-Picayune and the State's paper were busy attacking each other with statistics and accusations, what none of them could admit was that the real hand behind it all wasn't a politician. It was Zamore. He controlled the levers, and behind those levers stood a network of men who knew how to keep their mouths shut. The company's reach was global, but its backbone was built right there in Louisiana. The docks, the labor, the influence, Zamore had all of it. And when it came to protect that empire, he didn't just turn to politicians. He turned to men who knew how to get things done off the books. That's why Marcello mattered. That's why Carollo stayed protected. And that's why figures like Philip Bucola and Raymond Patriarca up north mirrored the same strategy. You build a legitimate front, and behind it, you run an operation with muscle and leverage. From Boston to Baton Rouge, from Springfield to San Pedro Sula, the real business wasn't just in fruit. It was in control. Charlie Luciano wasn't the only name on the deportation list in 1946. He was just the start. By spring, another boss, just as dangerous, maybe more politically rooted, was forced out. This one wasn't from New York. He ran New Orleans. Silvestro Carollo, known as Silver Dollar Sam, had ruled the Crescent City with such weight that even federal agents admitted the local police didn't dare look him in the eye. When the deportation papers came, Carollo didn't panic. He handed off the operation to a younger, more methodical enforcer, Carlos Marcello. Everything Carollo had built, racketeering, politics, police payoffs, Marcello inherited and expanded. Carollo's power wasn't built on slot machines and dice tables. It was built on fear. Federal narcotics agents turned up dead. Street cops were gunned down at intersections in broad daylight. A series of high-profile shootings tore through New Orleans in the early 1930s, and every trail led back to Silver Dollar Sam. Under pressure from Washington, and with the press turning the spotlight inward, the authorities finally moved. Like Luciano, Carollo was placed on a plane and flown to Italy. But unlike Luciano, he didn't stay there. He surfaced in Mexico, then back in the United States, quietly. By 1950, the feds caught up with him again and deported him, again. But the removal didn't end his influence. From exile, Carollo evolved. He built ties with Corsican traffickers, moving heroin through Marseille under the quiet cover of French intelligence. He wired that operation straight into Marcello's infrastructure in New Orleans. Heroin flowed through Mexico, moved across the border, and dropped into the Gulf, his old stomping grounds. Carollo wasn't gone. He was offshore, operating through trusted hands. Even decades later, the name still triggered whispers. In 1966, he came back, again, amid growing tension between his son and Marcello. And when Carollo returned, it wasn't for nostalgia. It was unfinished business. Back in 1930, when reporters still printed names without flinching, Carollo had already earned his reputation. On a December night, William Bailey was gunned down outside his car on Governor Nichols Street. Shotgun hit, textbook. Bailey didn't die on the spot. At the hospital, with what breath he had left, he gave the cops a name, Silvestro Carollo. Police arrested him within hours. Bailey's killing was tied to hijackings, a likely warning over bootlegging turf. 4 shooters were suspected, but Carollo was the only name that mattered. A few weeks later, police raided a pool room on St. Mary Street. Behind a loose wall plank, they found 5 revolvers and a sawed-off automatic shotgun. The Dallo brothers, Anthony and George, were caught red-handed. One of the pistols had been fired 6 times. The shotgun shells matched the kind used in a New Year's Eve robbery at the Whitney Bank, where 2 were killed and 2 more left bleeding on the floor. Cops connected the dots. That arsenal belonged to someone, and every detective knew whose playbook it came from. In February 1932, the federal government widened its scope. 104 indictments dropped in what prosecutors called an international ring. It wasn't just bootlegging, it was a network that stretched from Vancouver to Belize and the Louisiana swamps. Federal agents tied the entire operation to Al Capone. But the New Orleans leg, that was Carollo and Frank Todaro. The indictment read like a who's who of organized crime. Rum runners, ex-cops turned traffickers, millionaire distillers, politicians. Liquor came through British Honduras, smuggled north by sea into the marshlands, then moved in convoys protected by bribes and bullets. The syndicate had its own ships, its own radio network, and even its own fleet of trucks. Ted Newbury, one of Capone's men, was reportedly overseeing the offloads in the Gulf. In Mississippi, the rank and file believed this syndicate had big money backing and law enforcement cover to match. Among the accused, the Bronfman family of Montreal, Vancouver exporters, and dozens of men from Kllum, Mississippi, a town that looked like a postcard but had its own payroll of mob money. There were New York men, Chicago men, deputies, bankers, shopkeepers. And standing above them all, Carollo. Even prison didn't erase him. In 1932, while the indictments were being unsealed, Carollo and Todaro were both already serving time at Atlanta Federal Pen. When their time ran out, the government was waiting, with more charges and new strategies. But Carollo wasn't playing checkers. He was playing for survival. In 1946, with another deportation looming, he tried a new angle. This time, it wasn't muscle. It was paperwork. Carollo's lawyer connected with Congressman James Morrison of Hammond, Louisiana. Morrison submitted a private bill in Congress that would have made Carollo a citizen by oath. One signature, and the deportation order disappeared. But the press caught wind. Carollo's record, assault, narcotics, a dead federal agent, was public. He wasn't some misunderstood immigrant. He was a headliner. Morrison backpedaled fast. He claimed he didn't know Carollo's history and said the bill was a favor for a friend, Carollo's lawyer. The legislation quietly died at the end of the session, but the message was loud. Even in exile, Carollo could still move the pieces. Delays followed. Extensions were granted. He was scheduled to leave by April 14, 1947, but bought 2 more weeks. Finally, on April 30th, he agreed to go. Voluntarily. He flew to Rome, paid for the ticket himself. The government saved a few $100s. Carollo saved face. He left from New York, gave the feds his address, 3522 Clermont Drive, and vanished. Officially, that was the end. Unofficially, he never left. By 1950, Carollo was back. He was hiding near Slidell, Louisiana, just outside New Orleans, living under a fake name, running a front with another deported gangster, Salvatore Kansas City Sam Guarneri. The place was clean, air-conditioned, furnished like a Park Avenue apartment. The store out front, run by Sam DiMicelli, sold nothing. It was a prop. The real action was behind the drywall. 8 months before the bust, the property had been quietly transferred through relatives. No one at the courthouse questioned the names. When federal agents raided the house, there was no shootout. Just 2 men in silk shirts, cuffed in their own living room. The arrests followed a broader underworld shake-up. Just weeks earlier, Charles Banaggio, a political fixer and mob figure out of Kansas City, was found dead. Insiders called it a warning to any boss trying to consolidate too much power. Carollo had been spotted in Tijuana before the hit, then disappeared. Now he was back, again, charged with illegal re-entry, $10,000 bail, booked into the New Orleans Parish Prison. The feds weren't playing defense anymore. Carollo's rap sheet stretched from bootlegging and narcotics to attempted naturalization fraud. And the man who once tried to make him a citizen, Congressman Morrison, was nowhere in sight. That political muscle had dried up. This time Carollo was on his own. The truth had a way of leaking out, even in Louisiana. Slowly the shadows that protected the syndicate began to shrink under the glare of federal light. The same state that would later feel abandoned during Hurricane Katrina, left bleeding while the nation looked away, had long been used to being forgotten. But the people never forgot their history. It was soaked in blood. Real blood. In New Orleans, lynching wasn't a metaphor. It was memory. And one lynching in particular never faded. the 1891 massacre that followed the assassination of police chief David Hennessy. 11 Italian immigrants, some of them just acquitted at trial, were torn from their jail cells and murdered by a mob. Their only real crime was being Sicilian in a city boiling with anti-immigrant rage. It wasn't just about justice, it was politics. At the time, Italian-American voters leaned toward the corrupt local political machine instead of the Reform Democrats. The new mayor, backed by reformists, had his own reasons to fuel that fire. The lynching wasn't just tolerated, it was used. Decades later, when Carlos Marcello sat at the dinner table with his family, reading the headlines that painted him as a gangster, he didn't have to explain what he was doing. His in-laws were part of the oldest criminal infrastructure in New Orleans. What he had to explain was why these stories were coming out now. He told them about 1891, about how the Italians were hunted, dragged from homes, beaten in the streets, businesses destroyed, families scattered like dust. It wasn't about crime, it was about fear. That mob didn't need facts, it needed a target. Now, in the 1950s, it was happening again. Only this time, the mob was carrying notebooks, cameras, subpoenas. The newspapers weren't printing about the politicians. They were only printing the names of the gangsters. His name, his brothers, his business partners. The heat was coming, and it wasn't going to be fair, and it wasn't random. The headlines were coordinated with Washington. The Kefauver committee was in full swing, and Marcello knew exactly what that meant. The committee's obsession with organized crime wasn't just about law and order. It was about optics. The committee, filled with Anglo-Saxon Protestants, many of them with quiet disdain for Catholics and Jews, was now aiming that prejudice towards southern Italians. Marcello explained it to his family like a storm passing through. They would ride it out together. But it wouldn't be pretty. In January 1951, the New Orleans States broke the first story. Kefauver's investigators wanted to know whether 2 Italian men killed in the 1940s, Tommy Siracusa and Gene Marno, were victims of a mafia war. Siracusa had been indicted for Marno's death before he vanished. His body turned up headless, dumped near Gentilly Highway. Marno's corpse had been buried in a shallow grave across the river. Then came the questions about 5,000 missing slot machines that disappeared from the city before Mayor Morrison took office. Investigators wanted records, names, details, anything that could lead to the truth behind the city's buried empire. Subpoenas went out like wildfire. They didn't stop at Marcello. They hit Governor Earl Long, Mayor de Lesseps Morrison, parish sheriffs, detectives, state investigators, and casino owners, including Phil Castell, Marcello's business partner at the Beverly Country Club, a luxurious Jefferson Parish casino with connections all the way to Frank Costello in New York. Marcello's name was printed alongside every one of his brothers, Joseph, Anthony, Peter, Sam, Vincent, and Pasquale. Even his father, Joseph Sr., was listed. The government wasn't just going after Carlos, they were going after the entire bloodline. By the end of January, it was clear that the feds weren't just interested in New Orleans. They were pulling threads that stretched from Louisiana to Washington, from gambling rooms to congressional offices. And for the first time, the public was seeing it in print. The Miami Herald confirmed it. A Senate subcommittee, led by Senators Toby, Wiley, and O'Connor, was opening hearings in New Orleans. Dozens of witnesses were called. Among them, Marcello, Castell, Allen, St. Louis Red Allen, and officials who had looked the other way for years. When January 25th came, 2 men refused to speak, Marcello and Red Allen. They sat stone-faced as the committee warned them that every unanswered question could lead to contempt charges. Mayor Morrison didn't hold back. He laid out the connections. He said Costello first brought his slot machines to New Orleans in 1936, generating $3 million a year. He said Castel and Costello weren't just visitors, they were partners with Marcello. Morrison painted a picture of national syndicates embedded in Louisiana's local economy. Slot machines, racing wires, casinos, jukeboxes, pinball fronts. Every corner of entertainment had a price tag, and that money flowed upward into criminal hands. He detailed shell companies like the Dixie Coin Machine Company, Rex Coin Machine, and One Stop Coin Machine, all allegedly tied to Marcello and his associates. Then came the connections to Meyer Venacci, the Manhattan Amusement Company, and Smitty Novelty. The deeper investigators dug, the more they found lines running from the French Quarter to Chicago, New York, and Havana. Chicago Whitey and the L&R Amusement Company. Blue Eagle handbooks, Little Kino, real estate fronts. Witnesses like Sigali suddenly vanished, reportedly getting medical treatment in Chicago. But the story didn't stop with machines and nicknames. Morrison told the committee plainly, the axis of Costello, Castel, and Marcello was not welcome in New Orleans. But they were there, powerful, protected. And this was only the beginning. By the close of January 1951, the air in New Orleans was thick with tension. The press, the politicians, and the public all had their eyes on the Kefauver hearings. The walls were closing in on Carlos Marcello and the men who had once operated with near impunity under the live oaks and neon signs of Louisiana's underworld. What had once been whispered in gambling dens and sheriff's back rooms was now being shouted across headlines. And the very next day, the newspapers made it official. Carlos Marcello had refused to testify. He wasn't alone. Alongside him were other figures who had helped build a web of rackets spanning slot machines, casinos, jukebox fronts, and racing wires, most of them rooted in Jefferson and St. Bernard parishes. These men weren't street thugs. They were polished, calculating, and deeply embedded in both business and politics. They knew how to stay just low enough to avoid being caught, but now their names were being read into congressional record. January 26th, 1951. This was the day the veil was lifted. The day New Orleans got a glimpse of just how deep the rot ran. The mayor, de Lesseps Morrison, didn't hold back. He testified with a vengeance. He painted a picture of Jefferson Parish as a lawless haven for wide-open gambling, casinos with valet parking and mob ties, operating in broad daylight, untouched by law enforcement. Morrison pointed directly to the Castel-Marcello axis, describing how it had grown into a full-blown syndicate, controlling everything from racing wires to pinball routes, coin machine companies, and slot operations. It wasn't just about gambling. It was about control. Marcello's name was dragged through every corner of the testimony. Morrison said that Marcello and his men had been forced out of New Orleans proper. But that didn't mean they'd gone away. They'd just set up shop across the river, in parishes where the sheriff answered the phone like it was a personal favor. Then came the hard numbers. Morrison reminded the committee that back in 1936 and 1937, Frank Costello, Phil Castle, and their circle had taken in close to $3 million from New Orleans slot machines alone. By the time they were finally indicted for tax evasion in 1939, they'd skipped out on more than $500,000 in federal taxes. It was proof, cold, hard, financial proof, that the network stretched back decades and was now feeding off the very foundation of local government. The hearing room was packed. Reporters scribbled notes. Marcello sat there, silent as a tombstone, refusing to answer a single question. But the truth was already out. Morrison wasn't just describing past crimes. He was outlining the structure of an empire. One Stop Coin Machine Company, Manhattan Amusement Company, Dixie Coin, Rex Coin. These were the legal faces of a criminal machine greased with cash and protected by corrupt officials. He even named the men who ran the distribution: John Bertucci, Marion Matranga, Meyer Venacci. Men who weren't household names but were running jukebox routes and coin businesses that funneled cash straight back into syndicate hands. The mayor accused Castell of backing nearly every pinball operator in Jefferson Parish. And from there, it got uglier. Chicago Whitey, Morrison said, was tied to Castell through the L&R Amusement Company. Blue Eagle Distributing. Illegal handbooks. Lottery outfits. St. Louis Red. Allen was suddenly everywhere in the testimony, connected to Whitey, to Sigali, and to Keno outfits stretching across St. Bernard Parish. One name led to another. One company led to another. It was a trail of shell businesses, dead witnesses, front men and families protecting one another under the guise of old country loyalty. On January 25, 1951, the first testimonies gave the American public a rare look at what really powered New Orleans. It wasn't just jazz and beignets. It was syndicates, casinos, and political favors traded like poker chips. And Carlos Marcello, silent in that chair, already knew. The age of invisibility was over. Carlos Marcello had barely left the witness chair when another bombshell exploded, this time in Baton Rouge. The governor himself, Earl Long, was dragged into the storm. Word came down from the capital. A grand jury was being summoned to investigate gambling operations in East Baton Rouge Parish. District Attorney Ritchie had heard enough. Testimonies, whispers, reports of backroom deals, all of it. He wanted it officially. It was a rare move, even in a state as famously corrupt as Louisiana. Ritchie wasn't bluffing. He wanted to put 50 to 60 witnesses under oath, starting with a few familiar names, like Claude Duke, a former city patrolman, and Ernest Smith, the man who once wore the chief of police badge in East Baton Rouge. Smith was out now, but his name still echoed in every serious conversation about vice and payoffs. On January 27, 1951, the Associated Press broke the story. Ritchie told the press that the grand jury would open on February 5th and that he'd be leading the charge personally. They were aiming high. 2 former state police officials, former sheriffs, and a long list of others were on deck. What they were looking for wasn't just nickel and dime bribes. Ritchie said it bluntly. We want to determine whether there was a concerted attempt to block law enforcement officials from doing their duty, and whether there was gambling, illegal liquor activity, or prostitution tolerated or protected by persons holding public office. This wasn't about shutting down a few slot machines. This was about ripping out the roots. The announcement sent a chill down to New Orleans. Everyone in the network, from coin machine men in Jefferson Parish to former slot runners in Baton Rouge, knew what was coming. Ritchie wasn't part of the old system. He wasn't looking for a payoff. He had no interest in joining the game. That made him dangerous. By the time January 29, 1951 rolled around, the front pages had already turned Marcello into a household name, and not in the way he wanted. That morning, the Times-Picayune confirmed what most already knew. Carlos Marcello and Edward St. Louis Red Allen had pleaded the Fifth. The Kefauver committee had spent the better part of 3 days dragging New Orleans' underworld out of the shadows and into the Senate record. 20 witnesses were called. Some talked, some squirmed. But Marcello and Allen said nothing, not a word that could be used, not a single sentence that gave up the ghost. They hid behind the Constitution, invoking the Fifth Amendment each time a senator so much as looked at them. It was more than silence. It was strategy. These weren't men who feared courtrooms. They feared records. Because once the truth was recorded, it was hard to bury. Once the public heard it, it couldn't be unheard. Marcello wasn't just a name whispered in Jefferson Parish backrooms anymore. He was now in the papers, on the Senate floor, etched into the transcripts of a federal investigation. The committee's New Orleans stop had officially wrapped. Chairman Estes Kefauver was already en route to Los Angeles, where the spotlight would soon shift to California's brand of organized crime. But before leaving town, Kefauver dropped a quote that hit like a slap. The New Orleans hearings produced some of the most sensational revelations of this investigation. He wasn't exaggerating. Kefauver had seen enough in New Orleans to realize what everyone on the street already knew, that rackets in Louisiana weren't just tolerated, they were protected. In places like Jefferson and St. Bernard parishes, gambling houses operated openly, backed by men like Phil Castile, Marcello and Costello, with support trickling down from corrupted lawmen and bought-off politicians. But it wasn't just about gambling anymore. It was about power. Who had it? Who protected it? And who was finally bold enough to go after it? And now, as the committee packed up and moved west, it left behind a city in turmoil. Headlines were pointing fingers. Grand juries were warming up. And men like Marcello were finding that their silence, once a shield, was becoming a story of its own. When Senator Estes Kefauver packed up his televised hearings and left town, Carlos Marcello didn't feel relieved. He felt exposed. The national spotlight had torn through his gambling empire and labeled him as a cog in the global narcotics machine. What they didn't realize was that they had just put the wrong man on the map. By the early 1950s, Marcello wasn't just running Louisiana. He was planting his flag in global territory. Marcello had already begun to channel his money into legitimate industries and international influence. The coup in Guatemala, staged to benefit the United Fruit Company, didn't go down without him. Neither did the expansion of American interests across South America, parts of Africa, or southern Italy, where the Mafia had re-emerged as a crucial anti-communist tool. Deals were being cut in the shadows, new alliances formed, and old loyalties called in. Kefauver thought he'd uncovered a crime ring. What he really stumbled onto was the outer tentacle of something far deeper, an intelligence alliance rooted in espionage, money, and murder. That something was Operation Gladio. It began in the wreckage of post-war Europe. By 1948, the United States and its allies had already decided that democracy alone wouldn't be enough to hold back communism. In Italy, where the Communist Party was on the brink of electoral victory, the CIA, still in its infancy, backed a covert campaign to manipulate the first democratic elections since Mussolini's fall. This was Gladio's origin, a stay-behind network of secret armies backed by NATO and run through American and British intelligence, with quiet nods from the Vatican and strategic handshakes with organized crime. By 1990, long after the Cold War had left its bloodied fingerprints across half the globe, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stood before Parliament and admitted it. Yes, secret armies had existed. Yes, Italy was involved. And yes, a report would be released. But when that report finally landed, it was redacted into irrelevance. Other countries, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, launched inquiries of their own, but none got far. NATO stayed silent. Washington buried its head. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the whole affair had been pushed into the shadows. Another Cold War ghost story. But it wasn't fiction. The documents exist, the operatives existed, and the networks, across Italy, France, Germany, and Latin America, were real. What remains are circumstantial links, scattered events, political assassinations, military coups, narcotics pipelines, and the same small circle of names and money surfacing again and again. At the center of it all, Italy. By the end of World War II, Italy was a country split not by language or ethnicity, but ideology. In the north, where resistance fighters had fought tooth and nail against the Nazis, communism had taken hold. In the south, especially in Sicily, power was still held by the church, conservative landowners, and the Mafia, groups with no appetite for socialist revolution. This ideological divide became the CIA's playground. Their first move came through the Marshall Plan. $13.7 billion in aid flowed into Europe, on paper, to rebuild. But in practice, over $600 million of those dollars were skimmed by the CIA to fund Gladio and other covert programs. That money flooded into anti-communist cells, mafia-linked ports, and friendly church institutions. It was laundered through State departments, hidden in Vatican banks, and moved with the help of trusted middlemen who didn't ask questions. In Sicily, the Americans turned to old friends. During the war, Lucky Luciano, still behind bars in upstate New York, had already provided intelligence to the Navy for the Allied invasion of the island. Luciano pointed them straight to Don Calogero Vizzini, a mafia boss with deep roots in Sicilian society. The OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, dropped emissaries into Don Calo's estate with one message: guide the tanks, open the roads, and in return, we'll make you mayor of your town. And they did. Vizzini got his village, and with it, control of the region. The police chief who had opposed him was found dead. Luciano's old neighborhood ally, Charles Poletti, the former lieutenant governor of New York, was flown in to govern Italy under the Allied military government. Poletti gave Genovese's men full control of the ports. Through those docks flowed the heroin trade that would bankroll organized crime from Naples to New York for decades. The Gladio network needed muscle, and Sicily provided it. But the Vatican provided cover. Wild Bill Donovan, head of the OSS, dispatched Earl Brennan to liaise with Vatican Undersecretary Monsignor Giovanni Montini, the future Pope Paul VI. Montini offered names, allies, safe havens. In many ways, the Vatican was the perfect partner. It had a sovereign banking system, diplomatic immunity, and a global reach that no intelligence agency could match. Churches and monasteries became drop sites, communication nodes, and safe houses. Priests became couriers, bishops became bagmen. This was the real architecture of Gladio, a trinity of intelligence, organized crime, and religion, each dependent on the others to maintain control over post-war Europe and, increasingly, the developing world. The Cold War wasn't just fought in Berlin or Saigon. It was fought in union halls in Sicily, on banana plantations in Central America, and in smoke-filled backrooms in New Orleans. Because as Luciano and Vizzini were carving up southern Italy, Carlos Marcello was rising fast in Louisiana. Silver Dollar Sam had been the king of the New Orleans rackets, but once he was deported, Marcello stepped in. He had the ports, he had the politics, and most importantly, he had Irving Davidson. Davidson was the DC bagman who moved money between dictators, mobsters, and senators. He was Marcello's shadow operator in Washington, a man who could get your name off a list or your case out of court. With Davidson greasing palms and Gladio expanding, Marcello became more than a regional boss. He became a stateside node in a transnational network, one that moved money, drugs, votes, and bodies with the same ease as bananas and sugar. And through it all, the same names keep showing up: Luciano, Lansky, Carlo Gambino, Don Carlo Vizzini, Poletti, Silvestro Carollo, Carlos Marcello. What connects them isn't just crime. It's the infrastructure of global control. The same ports used to smuggle dope-funded coups in Guatemala. The same church officials blessing marriages were laundering drug money. And the same gangsters dodging subpoenas were sitting in on strategy meetings with CIA operatives. This wasn't fiction. This was Gladio. Organized crime, so often associated with the American Northeast, found a remarkable range of new opportunities in the southern rim, thus propelling these networks to previously inconceivable heights. These weren't just drug traffickers anymore. They were developers, oilmen, casino operators, and stakeholders in a booming tourism empire. The Mafia, particularly the factions allied with Carlos Marcello, were moving in parallel with the rise of Texas oil independence. They rode the same wave: tourism, real estate, gambling, and narcotics. All of it was now flowing through corridors that ran from Mexico up into southern Texas. But if you want to understand how the crime syndicate fused with establishment wealth, you start at Hotel Del Charro, California's back-channel embassy for oil barons, intelligence figures, and men with blood under their fingernails. Clint Murchison Sr., Texan oilman, pipeline king, power broker, once said, "Money is like manure. If you spread it around, it does a lot of good." At Del Charro, he spread it liberally. Murchison bought the La Jolla resort in 1951, and what followed was a quiet storm. Over the next 2 decades, the hotel became a fortress of secrecy, where billionaires, mobsters, spooks, and political players shared cocktails and cut deals. It was the cowboy version of Washington's Georgetown set, but with more oil money and fewer scruples. And, at the center of it all, year after year, was J. Edgar Hoover. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was no stranger to the resort. He had been coming since the 1930s, long before Murchison owned the place. But after the sale, his loyalty was paid for, in full. Murchison not only covered Hoover's suite and meals, but he also allegedly paid for everything. According to author Anthony Summers, Hoover racked up more than $460,000 in expenses, spread out across 18 summers, all courtesy of the oil tycoon. But Hoover didn't just come for the sun, he came to gamble. His obsession with horse racing bordered on compulsive. The nearby Del Mar racetrack became his temple. And in 1954, at Hoover's own request, Murchison bought the racetrack from Al Hart, a Los Angeles liquor wholesaler with deep ties to the Chicago outfit, a man rumored to have bootlegged with Capone and possibly rubbed shoulders with Joe Kennedy during the Prohibition years. Hart didn't want to sell, but Hoover wanted the deal done. According to Summers, Hoover sent 2 FBI agents to make sure Hart understood the urgency. The deal closed. The track was transferred into the ownership of a Murchison-run charity called Boys Inc., a charitable front that by all accounts operated like a sophisticated money laundering operation. Despite Del Mar generating millions in gross revenue, its net profit barely registered, just $50,000 a year on paper. The money was being funneled through tax shelters, through dummy charities, through the FBI's own director. Murchison not only covered Hoover's gambling losses, he let him keep the winnings. It was bribery without a bag of cash. Casinos, racetracks, and now even charities became vehicles for bribes that left no fingerprints. Hoover was compromised, and he knew it. On one side, he was taking handouts from the Texas oil elite. On the other, he was being blackmailed by the Northeast mob through Roy Cohn's infamous blue suede sex parties at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Hoover was stuck between the men bribing him and the men who had the photos, and both groups had one thing in common: they were building something in the South. Del Charro wasn't just a resort, it was a staging ground. The Bay of Pigs invasion may have been planned in Washington, but its seeds were planted poolside in La Jolla. Johnny Roselli, mob fixer and CIA asset, was spotted there. So was Richard Nixon, then just vice president, already a favorite of the oil aristocracy. Murchison and his partner Sid Richardson would become major backers of Nixon's White House bids in 1960 and 1968. But in 1961, there was one man in particular who couldn't be ignored. That April, a speedboat cut through the waters near the Louisiana coast and approached a private camp. David Russo, mob associate and local enforcer, climbed ashore. With him there was a seaplane flying low over the marsh, circling in for a landing. Inside was a short, stocky man in his 50s with graying temples and a crooked smile, Carlos Marcello. Russo's boys helped unload crates of liquor as Marcello greeted them in Italian. They knew who he was. Everyone did. He'd been all over the papers. The feds were hounding him again, desperate to nail him on something, anything. They finally found an old 25-year-old marijuana charge and used it to label him an undesirable alien. On paper, he wasn't American. And just like that, he was deported to Guatemala. That night, back in Lafayette, a local disc jockey read the story over the air. Carlos Marcello had vanished in Guatemala. The FBI had lost him. The high-profile deportation was crumbling into embarrassment. But what they didn't realize was that Marcello had walked right back into territory where he held deep influence. Guatemala wasn't just the end of the line. It was his turf. He had connections in the country's government, in customs, and most importantly, in United Fruit Company Corporation. So entrenched in Central America, it had helped install dictators. Marcello didn't just know how to get a forged birth certificate, he knew who to ask. The same hands that helped bring down democratically elected leaders now helped a mafia boss get back into the United States. Dean Andrews Jr. was one of those lawyers who didn't look like much on paper, but could work magic in a courtroom. Heavy-set, usually in dark sunglasses even indoors, and with a street-smart wit that could disarm a jury, he had the kind of charisma that made people trust him, even when they knew they shouldn't. But Andrews wasn't just a showman. He was smart, calculating, and in deep with some of the most powerful men in New Orleans, including Carlos Marcello. Andrews had long been part of Marcello's inner legal circle. He was more than just an attorney. He was a fixer, someone who could keep loose ends from unraveling. By 1962, Andrews was professionally linked to David Ferry, a disgraced pilot and one-time seminarian with strange habits, dangerous friends, and a record of disturbing behavior. Ferry worked under G. Ray Gill, one of Marcello's most trusted attorneys, as a law clerk and investigator. That put Ferry, and by extension Andrews, in close contact with the legal engine that protected Marcello's empire. Then came Lee Harvey Oswald. Andrews would later testify that Oswald showed up at his office in the Maison Blanche building several times in 1963. According to Andrews, and corroborated in part by his office staff, Oswald was looking for legal help to overturn his undesirable Marine Corps Reserve discharge. On his first visit, he was accompanied by what Andrews called some Mexican gay kids, one of whom seemed especially close to him. Andrews didn't press the issue. In his world, the strange was normal. Oswald came back more than once, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, and always talking about the same goal: clearing his military record. Then, the president was killed. The day after the assassination, Andrews, laid up in Hotel Dieu with pneumonia, got a call. The voice on the other end said his name was Clay Bertrand. He wanted Andrews to travel to Dallas to represent Oswald. Andrews was sick, couldn't go, and tried to refer the caller to someone else. That might have been the end of it, except that name, Bertrand, would come back to haunt him. At first, the FBI took down the statement and moved on. But when Jim Garrison, the ambitious and controversial district attorney in New Orleans, launched his own investigation years later, that name became the cornerstone of his theory. Clay Bertrand, he insisted, was an alias for Clay Shaw, a respected businessman with ties to intelligence circles and a hidden past. Andrews was pulled back into the spotlight. Garrison needed him to confirm that Bertrand and Shaw were the same person. At first, Andrews claimed he couldn't say for sure. Then, under pressure, he changed course. Bertrand, he now claimed, wasn't Shaw. It was Eugene Davis, a gay nightclub operator and former client. He said he'd lied to protect Davis from the media circus. So, I lied, he admitted to the grand jury. I committed perjury. Garrison wasn't amused. Andrews was indicted for perjury on March 16, 1967. The grand jury charged that he had lied about his knowledge of Bertrand's identity. Judge Thomas Brani set his bond at $1,000. Not long after, Andrews was suspended from his role as assistant district attorney in Jefferson Parish. His boss, Frank Langridge, said the suspension wasn't about guilt, just optics. Andrews had brought too much attention. The trial became a media circus. Garrison's team read aloud transcripts of Andrews' own contradictory testimony. In one instance, Andrews openly admitted to lying during the March testimony. His defense argued he had been protecting a client, and that identifying Davis would have served no purpose except to drag another man into the mess. But Garrison's strategy was clear. Pressure Andrews, crack his story, and expose the network he believed was behind the assassination. The pressure on Andrews was unrelenting. Mark Lane, who had publicly defended Oswald and published Rush to Judgment, recalled that Andrews initially agreed to appear in his film. But when the crew arrived in New Orleans, Andrews backed out. He later admitted, according to Lane and 6 witnesses, that he had received a phone call warning him, "You'll get a hole in your head if you do the film." Andrews stuck to the code. He never gave up Ferry. He never flipped on Marcello. And even with the system turning against him, he refused to identify Clay Shaw as Bertrand. In August 1967, a 5-man jury convicted Andrews on 3 counts of perjury. Judge Frank Shea sentenced him to 18 months in prison to run concurrently. Andrews filed an appeal and was released on a $2,500 bond. Behind the scenes, Andrews was unraveling. He was battling a pill addiction. He was paranoid, erratic, but still loyal. He accused Garrison of lying under oath during the pre-trial hearings, claiming that Garrison had decided he was guilty before he ever walked into the grand jury room. Andrews filed an affidavit in 1969, requesting that Garrison recuse himself from the case. He claimed that Assistant District Attorney Richard Burns had admitted Garrison thought Andrews was lying to the Warren Commission long before March 16th. If true, it would mean the perjury case had been built on a predetermined narrative. Andrews' claims were ignored. The courts backed Garrison. The media ran with it. And despite his efforts, Andrews remained a convicted perjurer in the public eye. But for those who understood the streets of New Orleans, Andrews' silence spoke volumes. In the background, the cast of Garrison's conspiracy unraveled. Sergio Arcacha Smith, the anti-Castro exile tied to the Camp Street address linked to Oswald's leaflets, refused to return to New Orleans without Dallas authorities present. He said he feared his life. Gordon Novell, another witness, skipped town. His attorney later claimed Novell was under maximum security in Ohio after being shot at in Nashville. When someone called and said, "If you don't bring him back to New Orleans, he'll come back in a hearse," the message was clear. This was no longer just about the law. Andrews, despite it all, kept his place inside the Marcello circle. Photos from 1970 showed him sitting next to Marcello, still whispering advice. He was one of the few men in New Orleans who touched the Kennedy case and lived to keep his loyalty intact. He knew where the bodies were buried. Maybe not literally, but politically, legally, reputationally. And he took that knowledge with him. Garrison's case against Shaw collapsed. Shaw was acquitted in 1969. The Clay Bertrand alias was never proven. Andrews, despite being the key that could have unlocked the whole thing, never turned. He was unreliable, flamboyant, self-destructive, but he was loyal to the end. In the world of Carlos Marcello, which was the only thing that mattered. Carlos Marcello wasn't just another mob boss with a temper and a crew. He was a man who believed in ownership. If you worked under him, you weren't just a soldier. You were his. Your secrets, your weaknesses, your debts, they belonged to him. And if you ever forgot it, he'd remind you. One of those men, deeply tethered to Marcello's operation, was David Ferry, a disgraced airline pilot with a brilliant mind, a volatile personality, and secrets that would have buried a lesser man. Ferry was, in many ways, the 1950s version of Barry Seal, Both were ex-commercial pilots with uncanny skills, a flair for risk, and connections that ran deep into the shadows of intelligence networks, mafia circuits, and Latin American regimes. And, like SEAL, Ferry flew missions that never officially existed, into places like Honduras, Guatemala, and Cuba. These weren't joyrides. These were off-the-books ops for companies and front groups tied to Alan Dulles and the Central Intelligence Agency. Their job? Deliver what others couldn't. Move arms, cash, drugs, documents, even human cargo. Ferry wasn't the only one, but he'd been doing it the longest, and he had the kind of contacts the CIA valued, especially when it came to setting up covert operations in the chaos of post-colonial Central America. Ferry and others would quietly infiltrate sympathetic villages, gain trust through bribes, aid and resources, then slip in weapons, military trainers, and eventually, mercenaries. Some recruits were even promised US citizenship if they trained and fought for the cause. It was an assembly line of insurrection. These operations led directly to coups and puppet regimes across Guatemala and Honduras. Generals on the take. Airports that weren't on maps. Entire countries opening themselves to mafia-backed ventures. Casinos, hotels, and restaurants, all under the quiet nod of Langley. Ferry's missions were often simple. Drop off, pick up. Narcotics, weapons, US dollars, heroin, even women. His network had its own private fleet of planes and hangars, run through front companies so clean they didn't appear on tax rolls. But Ferry, he couldn't keep his head down. He couldn't stay in the shadows. He started giving unhinged speeches, ranting about betrayal. His real venom was aimed at one man, John F. Kennedy. Ferry had helped arm anti-Castro Cuban fighters. He'd flown them, trained them. Many he'd met personally. Men who died screaming in the sand during the Bay of Pigs disaster. Ferry blamed Kennedy for that debacle, and he didn't keep it a secret. He ranted about it, loudly, to anyone who'd listen. But Ferry had another problem, one that everyone in Marcello's outfit knew about, one that the FBI, the CIA, and Carlos Marcello all had filed away as leverage. Ferry was a pedophile. It wasn't a rumor. It was on the record. In March 1962, Jefferson Parish Times reported that Judge Leo McCoon had found Ferry innocent on one charge of indecent behavior with a juvenile, but several others still loomed. Ferry had been suspended from his job as a pilot, booted from the Civil Air Patrol, and accused of threatening juveniles, intimidating witnesses, and committing crimes against nature. One teen claimed Ferry had coerced him into signing a statement dropping charges. The legal case spiraled, but the court of public opinion wasn't as forgiving. Ferry was radioactive. And Carlos Marcello? He kept those court records close, like a loaded weapon. That same summer, June 1962, another name drifted back into Ferry's orbit, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald had just returned from the Soviet Union, thinking he'd be greeted by a media circus. He wasn't. Instead, he was met by his worried brother, Robert Oswald, in Dallas. Lee had expected headlines, questions, attention. What he got was paranoia. The world was knee-deep in Cold War hysteria, the Bay of Pigs still fresh, the Red Scare pulsing, and the Cuban Missile Crisis just months away. To Ferry, Oswald wasn't a curiosity. He was an opportunity. Ferry saw a way to redeem himself, to prove to Marcello that he was still useful. He wasn't the only one circling Oswald. So were Guy Bannister, former FBI agent turned right-wing provocateur, and men inside New Orleans who wanted one enemy gone, Robert F. Kennedy, and by extension, his brother, the president. Carlos Marcello hated the Kennedys, hated them. Robert had made it his personal mission to destroy the Mafia, and Carlos was public enemy number one. Ferry, Bannister, Oswald, they were tools in a larger game, Marcello's game, and in that game the rules were simple. Keep your friends close, your enemies closer, and your blackmail folders closest of all. David Ferry didn't exactly blend in. He stood 6 feet tall, maybe a little more, weighed a lean 190, and carried himself with a rigid, almost military precision, his back as straight as a flagpole. But something always seemed off. The hair on top of his head was the color of rusted copper, clearly dyed, and didn't quite match the hair above his eyes, which carried a different hue altogether. His left eyebrow sat a millimeter higher than the right, adding a permanent layer of tension to his already anxious face. People in the courtroom that Friday would remember Ferry for decades, not because of what he said, but because of the way he looked and moved. A strange mix of stern posture and erratic energy. He couldn't sit still. His left leg bounced like a jackhammer, his fingers twirled his pencil endlessly, and his eyes darted around the courtroom like he was scanning for a sniper. His muscles never relaxed. He was a man vibrating on the edge of panic. By contrast, his companions, Jack Wasserman, Attorney Gill, and the little man himself, Carlos Marcello, sat in cold-blooded calm, controlled, measured. Mafia men built for the long game. Ferry, however strange, had earned his spot in Marcello's inner sanctum. He wasn't just some eccentric hanger-on. He was useful. A former airline pilot, Ferry could fly just about anything with wings. He was also deeply religious in a warped, self-designed way. Raised in the Catholic tradition, Ferry had studied in not one, but 2 seminaries. He never made it to priesthood. His private urges clashed too violently with church doctrine, but he knew his theology inside out. His personal faith had mutated into something obsessive. In his apartment, he often held secret masses dressed in a purple cassock, burning incense, and reciting prayers like a man caught between heaven and hell. He idolized St. Augustine, the man who believed life was a war between God and the devil. And Ferry prayed daily that his own sins would somehow fall on the right side of that divide. But theology couldn't save him from politics, or from Robert F. Kennedy. The moment John F. Kennedy was sworn in, RFK made it personal. He went after Carlos Marcello like a bloodhound, wasting no time declaring him an illegal alien and unceremoniously deporting him. No trial, no delay, just yanked out of the country. 2 months later, thanks to Ferry and a quiet private flight, Marcello was smuggled back into the US. Litigation followed. The legal back and forth was a circus, but RFK wasn't finished. He brought a new charge, criminal fraud, accusing Marcello of using a fake birth certificate to conceal his immigration status. That charge was at the heart of the case, playing out in Judge Herbert Christenbury's courtroom in the Royal Street Courthouse. It was Friday, November 22nd, 1963, and the trial was nearing its end. Outside, the weather was grey, the wind cutting through a cracked courthouse window. Inside, the jury was being prepared for deliberation. But no one, not the jurors, not the spectators, not even the judge, could focus. Not really. Not that day. Because just after 1 p.m., a note was quietly handed to Judge Christenbury. He read it. Once, twice. He adjusted his glasses, licked his lips, and delivered it like a man who didn't quite believe what he was about to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm enormously sad to report that the president has been shot in Dallas. He is feared dead. The air left the room like someone had broken a window. Everyone froze. Gasps, stunned silence. Judge Christenbury tried to keep it together. My friends, I have no words of wisdom. I'm sorry to say, it's tragic. Just tragic. By God's grace, let's each say a private prayer for the president and his family. Ferry bowed his head. He muttered a prayer out loud. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord. Christenbury let the moment breathe before continuing. We've been at this trial for 3 weeks. It's Friday afternoon. My preference would be to send you to deliberate now, so we can all go home and grieve in peace. But if you'd rather wait until Monday." The jurors looked at each other. One spoke. "Let's finish it." The others nodded. At 1:45 p.m., they retired to deliberate. By 3:30 p.m., the verdict was in acquittal. The victory party at the Hotel Monteleone was already in full swing. Nobody cancelled it. Marcello's consigliere had locked down the entire Carousel bar days earlier, a rotating shrine to old New Orleans excess. The bar spun slowly on 2,000 rollers, red leather stools circling beneath a candy-striped umbrella, surrounded by circus murals and a ship in a bottle that hadn't moved since Hemingway last drank there. The place looked like a fever dream. Jazz spilled out of the speakers. Hurricanes from Pat O'Brien's crowded the tables, and the girls from the Shoe Bar and 500 Club floated through the room like apparitions. It was meant to be a celebration, a new chapter, a job well done. But Carlos Marcello wasn't there. Neither was David Ferry. While the carousel spun and the booze flowed, they were miles away, slipping into the shadows at Churchill Farms. Marcello didn't need the noise. Not tonight. The old boss had already made his calls, already pulled the necessary levers. He didn't need to gloat in public. He needed distance. Ferry followed orders. After Churchill Farms, Marcello told him to head straight home, and then to Houston. No detours, no drinks. He knew the next phase was coming, and fast. On his way home near Royal Street, he saw a middle-aged woman in a tailored suit, elegant but visibly shaken. She caught her breath when she saw him. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It really happened." She kept repeating it like a prayer or a curse. Ferry grabbed her gently by the shoulders. "Dr. Mary. Mom, you got to get out of here." "Where to?" "You don't want to know. Just lay low. Stay away from the lab." They hugged like old friends in a war zone. Tired, rattled, not entirely surprised. "Be careful, Dave," she said, her voice trembling. He handed her an envelope from the Town and Country Motel. She tucked it away without a word. David Ferry had been spiraling for months. Ever since the Bay of Pigs fell apart, he couldn't keep himself steady. The rants got louder. The rage got worse. He was emotional, volatile, especially around the people closest to him. One of those people was Mary. She was a doctor working alongside Ferry on a desperate side project. Something about a cancer cure, some kind of redemption arc for a man running out of time. But in between the lab work, Ferry would snap. He'd rage about the Kennedys, scream about betrayal, go off on wild rants about how the president needed to be eliminated. He didn't whisper it. He shouted it. And he did it in front of Mary. So, when Kennedy was shot, murdered exactly the way Ferry had described, people started asking questions, and some of those questions were aimed at Mary. After all, she was one of the few people who'd seen Ferry up close, seen the emotional unraveling, the connections. Ferry wasn't just some isolated lunatic. He had ties to Carlos Marcello, to Guy Bannister, to Oswald, to Dean Andrews, and Mary knew it. We don't know exactly what she said, but whatever it was enough to get her killed. Dr. Mary Sherman was murdered in 1964, brutally and without warning. When Ferry finally got home on Louisiana Avenue Parkway, the flicker of a 16-inch black and white Motorola television played to a silent, heavy room. The assassination had just broken across the airwaves. David Ferry stood alone in the back room, packing a small satchel he'd prepped days earlier. He paused to offer a whispered prayer, not for the president, but for himself. "Give me strength and the wisdom to endure what's coming. Let me handle this in a way that brings glory to your name." In the living room, Martins and John, Ferry's on and off roommates, were glued to the news, their faces pale in the glow of the screen. They barely registered Ferry slipping out the door. The sky was already darkening, and the storm clouds were thick with foreboding. Outside, Ferry slid into his newly acquired baby blue 1961 Comet station wagon. Under different circumstances, he would have flown himself to Houston. But this wasn't that kind of trip. Flying privately into Texas on the night the president had been murdered would have raised too many questions. Instead, he was to drive. Still, he was ready to fly out later if need be. A de Havilland Dove, a sturdy twin-engine British plane, had been stashed at Shoals Field on Galveston Island, on standby for a possible emergency escape run to Guatemala. But there was still no word on the second shooter. Only Oswald had been arrested. Ferry's heart sank. As a devout Catholic, his thoughts twisted in dark directions. Ruby had let him down, or maybe Marcello had played him from the start. It was possible Carlos pulled the plug himself. Maybe he told Ferry at the last minute, "You're not going to Dallas. You're not using the plane." The hit was going to happen on location, in plain view, and it was going to end right there, with Oswald. A dead patsy was cleaner than a missing one. No escape, no loose ends, no one left to talk. The cover-up would right itself. But now Ferry's mind was racing. Would they pin it all on Oswald? Would they come for him next? It wasn't the first time he thought about disappearing permanently. The drive to Houston was going to be long, 358 nerve-shredding miles across western Louisiana and into East Texas. And the weather was no help. The rain was coming down, like buckets tipped from the heavens. He didn't think he'd make it back alive. If the silence didn't kill him, the storm might. Ferry wasn't going alone. He needed witnesses, for company, sure, but more so for cover. If questions ever came up, they'd vouch for the story. On the way back from the Hotel Monteleone, he had the cab detour to pick up Alvin Beauboeuf, a 24-year-old mechanic and Ferry's closest straight-laced friend. Ferry grabbed him outside Joseph Cone Middle School, near his home on Alva Street, in the shadow of the crumbling and ghostly St. Vincent de Paul Sanatorium. Next stop, Melvin Coffey, an old friend he'd known for almost a decade. Coffey lived on North Pierce Street, near the moss-covered tombs of St. Louis Cemetery No. 3. They stopped at Melvin's place for last-minute logistics and checked the latest from Dallas on TV. They had a cover story, of course. They always did. It was supposed to be a pleasure trip. Fishing, hunting, maybe some drinking. Maybe they'd buy an ice skating rink in Houston. Ferry told them he was considering it as a new business venture, now that the Marcello trial was over. At Melvin's place, Ferry made 2 quick phone calls. The first was to pay a phone at the Winterland Ice Skating Rink in southwest Houston. No answer. The second was to book 3 rooms at a Houston motel connected to Marcello's network. They headed to the Fly-In restaurant, a joint that catered to pilots. Ferry ordered a ribeye, smoked through 2 cigarettes, and chatted with a few pilots about the weather. They left New Orleans at 9 at night as a storm started to hit the town, taking U.S. Route 90 west through Houma, Lafayette, and on toward Lake Charles. The rain pounded their car like a war drum. Whenever there was a break in the storm, the windshield was plastered with insects. They reached Houston at 3 in the morning, the dark, cloudy skies still hanging over them, driving straight to Winterland Ice Rink, located just 2 miles south of River Oaks, a stronghold of Texas oil wealth and conservative power. The rink sat still and lifeless under the night sky, its only adornment a giant cement pair of skates out front. Ferry stepped out, gravel crunching underfoot, and began inspecting the perimeter like a burglar casing a mark. "What the hell are you doing?" Al asked, rubbing his eyes. "I need to make sure no one's here." He jiggled the front door handle, locked, circled the building. Nothing. Maybe the second shooter was hiding here, Ferry thought. Maybe not. When Ferry stepped into the cold and picked up the outdoor payphone, there was no hesitation. His first call went straight to Attorney Gill, still up at his Camp Street office, drinking bourbon with Guy Bannister. They were waiting for this. "Keep checking the rink tomorrow," Ferry said. "Roland's meeting you. And yeah, go ahead and pull the trigger with Ruby, so to speak." Gill, already half in the bag, said he'd touched base with Ruby earlier from the Carousel bar at the Monteleone. "Call him again," he said. "Be direct. Bring up Dallas in October. And the thing about his sister and the damn dog, he'll probably mention it first." That wasn't just a joke. It was code. Something to say on a line that might have been tapped. The sister and the dog meant Ruby was already bought and paid for. Carlos Marcello was calling in a favor. The Campisi brothers, deep in Dallas rackets, had likely walked Ruby into Joe Civello's office and made it clear this was going to happen. If Ruby had any doubts before, they were gone now. Ruby had a sister, a brother, and some claimed, quietly, never on the record, that he and Ferry had once been intimate. Maybe that's why David trusted him. Or maybe it was just logistics. Either way, that trust was now on the table. What most people never heard was that Ruby had already made one attempt. He tried to get to Oswald inside police headquarters. Caught him sitting in an interview room. But a nearby officer stepped in, asked questions and shut it down. That cop may have saved Oswald's life that day. But the second time, it was sealed. Sergeant Patrick Dean made sure there'd be no mistakes. Ferry hung up, dropped more dimes, and called the Carousel Club in Dallas. Ruby's half-burlesque, half-sleaze operation. Ruby was still there, still playing host, even with the city in chaos. A gravelly voice picked up. "Carousel Club? Who the hell is this?" "None of your goddamn business," Ferry snapped. "Put Jack on." Larry Crayford, Ruby's errand boy and former carney, walked the phone over. Jack picked up. "Jesus, Dave," he said. "He got caught." Ferry knew what that meant. The kid, Oswald, was alive. For now. But he also knew the betrayal was bigger than anyone would ever admit. Oswald never stood a chance. Someone, maybe even Marcello himself, had changed the plan. Oswald was getting hit on sight. In public. Because a dead patsy was cleaner than a live one. If an Italian mobster had walked into the basement and shot Oswald, the press would have called it for what it was. There were easily a few hundred guys in the Dallas mob who could have handled it. But that wasn't the point. They needed someone different. Someone with a clean enough record to blend in. Someone already connected to the operations, moving quietly through Dallas, and someone with enough loved ones to be controlled. Jack Ruby fit the profile. He'd been moving guns for years. When he came to Dallas, he tapped into the same underworld stream that was feeding coups across the globe. Arms trafficking had become just as routine as narcotics. It was like prohibition all over again, except now the product was firepower, and the buyers were overseas. America supplied, and men like Marcello made sure the business kept running, under the quiet supervision of the CIA. Ruby had helped move that weight. He knew where the crates were going. He knew what kind of planes came in and out of private hangars. He wasn't just a club owner. He was a middleman in a pipeline that Washington never wanted traced. Now those ghosts were circling back. The same politicians, propped up by the CIA, were scrambling to bury what they never wanted to see. They had signed off on bills they never read, handed the agency blank checks, and kept their mouths shut. That silence was coming due. Ruby was the only man who could get close to Oswald without setting off alarms. And if he played his cards right, he might walk away with his family untouched. The outfit in Chicago had already helped wipe his record in Illinois. It would be like walking into court with a clean slate. But Ruby never stuck to one story. If you study him, you'll see it. His motives shifted every time he opened his mouth. And the lawyer he hired? A man deeply tied to both Santos Traficante and Carlos Marcello. Robert F. Kennedy had called him a mob lawyer to his face, if Ruby wanted to save his sister, if he wanted to save his brother. This was the move. Marcello had built layers of insulation. Bannister had the bureau. Ferry had the agency. Oswald was caught between both. Marcello's lobbyists in Washington kept him ahead of the curve, and his CIA connections gave him room to operate. He wasn't just protected. He was valuable. He had done business with the United Fruit Company, with oil interests like Penn Oil and Dallas Petroleum. Those firms later merged into what would become Shell. When Jack Ruby stepped out of the shadows and fired that fatal bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald, Carlos Marcello finally exhaled. It was done. The loose end had been tied. Oswald, the patsy, the wild card, was eliminated before he could talk. The boss of New Orleans, who had spent days on the edge, could now relax, just for a moment, knowing that his reach had extended far enough to silence the only man who could unravel everything. But Marcello understood something deeper. Now the cover-up would no longer rest on the shoulders of oddballs like David Ferry or rogue intelligence cowboys like Guy Bannister. No, real power would take over. Men in tailored suits, briefcases, and government seals. The kind of men who didn't take orders, they gave them. What was shocking, even to insiders, was that Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General and brother of the slain president, was so compromised that he had no choice but to play along. He hated Lyndon Johnson, despised him, but the balance of power had shifted, and now RFK was caught in the gears of the same machine he once tried to destroy. Johnson had inherited a White House still loyal to Kennedy, yet none of them trusted him, and he didn't trust them. Johnson wasn't even told about the assassination plots against Fidel Castro, or the CIA's black bag operations under the Kennedys' command. Plots that had involved murder, foreign coups, and, more disturbingly, the Mafia. The Diem brothers in Vietnam had been murdered under JFK's and RFK's direction. Their widowed sister-in-law, now living in the United States, aligned herself with Richard Nixon. Her late husband and his circle had allegedly been knee-deep in the narco-trafficking world, a secret the Kennedys knew but chose to hide. In this twisted Cold War chessboard, alliances were made not by ideology, but by usefulness. Even CIA Director John McCone didn't fully trust Johnson. But after Johnson won re-election in 1964, the CIA had no choice but to come clean. They briefed him on what the agency had been doing behind the scenes during the Kennedy years. Executions, sabotage, revolutions. Johnson exploded. "We've been running a murder incorporated in Central America," he bellowed. That fury wouldn't stay hidden. Just 2 years later, in 1967, the cracks began to surface publicly. When Jack Ruby stepped out of the shadows and fired that fatal bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald, Carlos Marcello finally exhaled. It was done. The loose end had been tied. Oswald, the patsy, the wild card, was eliminated before he could talk. The boss of New Orleans, who had spent days on the edge, could now relax. That year, Jack Anderson, the hard-nosed investigative journalist, started running a string of articles that threw Washington and the mob into chaos. One piece claimed the CIA had teamed up with the Mafia to kill Castro. But the men captured in Cuba, who later escaped and returned to the US, were the ones Anderson hinted who had actually turned around and killed Kennedy. Not for the mob. For Castro. A half-truth. A poisoned breadcrumb. The truth was, the CIA had worked closely with organized crime, recruiting gangsters like Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, Russell Bufalino, Carlos Marcello, and Santo Traficante to eliminate Castro. They also used Cuban exiles, paramilitary militias, and far-right operatives deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld. The Anderson articles triggered a manhunt, not for suspects, but for the leak. The Mafia's inner circle panicked. Rumors swirled, people died. Jimmy Hoffa, Sam Giancana, John Martino and others were killed in a wave of retaliatory purges. And yet all fingers pointed back to one man, Johnny Roselli. He had been feeding Anderson stories. Roselli, slick and silver-tongued, had been tight with Hollywood and Kennedy's West Coast crowd. That made him suspect in the eyes of Marcello and Trafficante. They didn't fully trust him, and rightly so. He hadn't been let in on their part of the Kennedy job, but Roselli had seen enough. He knew the players, he knew the deals, and he knew the danger of silence. That's when the next bombshell dropped. A mystery witness, known only as Mr. X, came forward. A founder of a Cuban paramilitary group with deep CIA ties, he swore under oath that 3 months before the assassination, he was introduced to Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas by a CIA agent. Mr. X said his group held secret meetings at 3126 Harlandale Avenue, and that a Dallas deputy sheriff had been tipped off shortly after the assassination that Oswald had been associating with Cubans at that exact location. His story echoed one long buried, that of Sylvia Oddio, the daughter of an anti-Castro exile. 2 months before the assassination, she'd told the FBI that 3 men came to her Dallas apartment claiming to be friends of her father. One introduced himself as Leon Oswald. When she saw Oswald's picture in the papers after the shooting, she collapsed. The Warren Commission had been ready to pursue Oddio's story. Some even speculated that anti-Castro groups had flipped the script, recruiting the pro-Castro Oswald to kill Kennedy to frame Castro himself. It would have been the perfect pretext for an invasion of Cuba. But J. Edgar Hoover shut it down. He told the commission that the FBI had already identified the visitors. Loran Hall, Lawrence Howard, and William Seymour, all known anti-Castro activists. Hoover implied Oddio had simply confused Leon with Lauren. Now investigators discovered all 3 had denied ever visiting Oddio's apartment before Hoover sent that letter. Hoover had lied. But that wasn't the most explosive detail. Mr. X said he had met Oswald face to face, in the company of a CIA agent he only knew as Morris Bishop. It happened in downtown Dallas, where X had gone for a meeting. Bishop fit a detailed description, tall, tanned, health-conscious, and using glasses only in recent years. If it wasn't Oswald, Mr. X said, then it was someone exactly like him, his exact double. He wasn't the only one to see the storm coming. On November 9th, 1963, Joseph Miltier, a far-right agitator with anti-Castro ties, was secretly recorded in Miami telling an FBI informant that Kennedy would be assassinated from an office building with a high-powered rifle. When the informant asked later if it was just a lucky guess, Miltier replied, "I don't do any guessing." And he had been in Dallas just a few months before. When the Jack Anderson article hit the presses in 1967, it ripped through the corridors of power like a thunderclap. Washington panicked. The FBI was rattled, the CIA scrambled, and organized crime, particularly in New Orleans, started asking one question: who was the source? For Carlos Marcello, it wasn't a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of life and death. He wasn't the kind of man to sit still while someone played Judas in his organization. He needed to know who was talking and who could tie him in a court of law to the murder of the President of the United States. Anyone who could be turned into a witness, anyone who might sit down in front of a grand jury and point the finger, would have to die. And in 1967, the kinds of people who built cases weren't strangers. They were inside men, district attorneys, sheriffs, lieutenants, judges, commissioners, politicians, even elements of the FBI. The system that was supposed to investigate men like Marcello had long been compromised by them. That's what made what happened next all the more dangerous. Shortly after Anderson's article broke, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison began whispering about a private investigation, his own probe into the Kennedy assassination. A local newspaper got wind of it and ran the story. That forced Garrison's hand. He went public. But it wasn't a wild, reckless move. It was calculated, even brilliant. At the time, there were rumblings that Robert F. Kennedy might make a run for the White House in 1968, possibly snatching the Democratic ticket and taking on Richard Nixon. For Marcello, which was the doomsday scenario. RFK had already come at him once, with deportation orders and legal knives sharpened. The idea that Bobby Kennedy might sit in the Oval Office, wielding the full power of the federal government, was unthinkable. But Marcello had something explosive. He knew what the Kennedys had done, what they had authorized, what they had buried, and what was still active. And much of it had taken place in his backyard. Covert operations, dark missions wrapped in the flag of national security, all of them touched by Robert F. Kennedy's fingerprints. And Garrison. He started to dig, not just into Oswald or Ruby, but into the operations themselves. Operation Mongoose, a campaign of sabotage and assassination aimed at Castro. Operation Tilt, a shady exfiltration mission run by right-wing Cubans and spooks. Operation Northwoods, a proposed false flag plan to justify war. And the early stages of COINTELPRO, when the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover began spying on civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. All of it had been born under the Kennedy administration. And now the same government that once used Marcello's territory as a playground for covert ops was watching Garrison expose it to the world. That was Marcello's move. That was the genius. He let Garrison dig, because the digging served two purposes. First, it sent a message to RFK. We know what you did. Stay the hell out of the South. If you come for us again, we'll come for your legacy. Second, and more sinister, it helped Marcello identify the rats. Garrison was a tool, whether he knew it or not. His subpoenas, his interviews, his press conferences. They flushed out the witnesses. The people who really knew too much. And once Marcello saw who they were, his cleanup crew went to work. One by one, the potential witnesses started dying. It wasn't a courtroom Marcello feared. It was a microphone in front of the wrong person. And as the chessboard of politics, intelligence, and organized crime reset itself in the late 1960s, Carlos Marcello made sure that every piece that could move against him was taken off the board, quietly, permanently, and without a trace. Carlos Marcello read everything. He didn't skim headlines, he studied them. Every edition of Life, Look and Time hit the doorstep of his hotels and restaurants as predictably as the rising sun. The New Orleans paperboy was on his payroll. Information was survival. And in the golden age of American print media, the mafia boss made damn sure he knew what stories were being fed to the public, and what was being kept in the shadows. Back then, America had time. Families still gathered at dinner tables. While kids passed plates and mothers dished out supper, fathers read the paper aloud. Not just the local obituaries or ball game recaps, but the pulse of Washington, the whispers of war, and the scandals simmering beneath the surface. Even though the Central Intelligence Agency had its icy fingers around the throat of the press, there were still some journalists out there who didn't kneel. Jack Anderson was one of them. When his 1967 article broke, linking Mr. X to the Kennedy assassination, Carlos didn't flinch. Not at first. He knew stories like that could be dismissed as conspiracy theory, unless there was hard proof to back it up. Then he heard the whispers. There was a photo. It was a name Marcello knew all too well. David Ferry. The strange little man who flew planes, wore wigs, and knew too much. Ferry had brought the kid around. The nut who was supposed to be used as a ghost, a nobody. Someone who would disappear into history. But now the streets were buzzing. There was a photograph showing Ferry with Oswald. Marcello would have snapped. He would have dragged Ferry into a back room and growled, "Is it true what I'm fucking hearing? There's a photo of you with this kid, the same kid you fucking brought to me to use for this hit. I told you I needed a ghost, not a known rat." And that's when Ferry knew. He was in the deep end. Because if anyone started investigating, if any photograph surfaced, if even a single link between Oswald, Ferry, Bannister and Marcello was made public, he was done. The feds would crawl all over him. The press would bury him. And Carlos Marcello would make sure no one heard from him again. After Kennedy was killed, Marcello kept Ferry under close surveillance, not out of loyalty, but because he couldn't afford a confession. He knew Ferry had cancer and was growing desperate, searching for cures in backroom clinics and backwoods medicine men. Ferry had started to believe the cancer was punishment, not medical but moral, something spiritual eating him alive. The betrayal of Oswald, the murder of a president, the way the Mafia and the CIA had used him as a pawn in a global chess game, it haunted him. But it was that photo that really gnawed at him. If it ever surfaced, if anyone in that picture started talking, it was over. And Marcello, he made sure to check. Even years later, he paid visits to the men and boys who had once been part of the Civil Air Patrol, the group where Oswald had first met Ferry. One photo, just one, could destroy everything. And then, in 1993, the damn thing resurfaced. By then, it was too late. A local man in Algiers, Tony Atzenhofer, told a reporter that he and his friend had the photograph. Oswald and Ferry side by side, at a campout near Alexandria in 1955. The photographer had been Chuck Francis, not the man misidentified in early reports. Francis, a public information officer, had snapped it during a Civil Air Patrol search and rescue exercise. And when asked about it, he confirmed it. He had shown it to the FBI, but had never told them what the photo showed. Front Line, the PBS documentary series, ran the image during their 3-hour special. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? It was the first hard proof that Oswald and Ferry knew each other, stretching back to their days as cadet and pilot. It didn't prove they conspired to kill the president, but it shredded Ferry's denials. He had claimed for years he never met Oswald. And yet, there they were, in the same photo, at the same time, at the same place. Former CAP cadets confirmed the link. Leighton Martins, a close friend of Ferry's, said he never heard David mention Oswald. But when they showed him the photo, even he couldn't deny it anymore. There's a possibility of an association. To what extent? That's another question. Michael Sullivan, the producer behind Front Line, summed it up best. As dramatic as this photograph is, we must be cautious. It supports the eyewitnesses who saw Ferry and Oswald together, but it does not prove they were together in 1963, or that they were involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. But Carlos Marcello in 1967 stories like Jack Anderson's didn't matter. One photograph was enough. Enough to create suspicion. Enough to make people talk. Enough to make people die. And in his world, that was one too many. By 1967, the leash was off. Carlos Marcello's men were no longer restrained. With Jimmy Hoffa locked up and the feds breathing down Labor's neck, Marcello wanted blood. He blamed the entire chain reaction on a rat local Louisiana boy named Ed Partin. Partin had flipped play Judas and helped bury Hoffa in a prison cell. Marcello's answer was immediate and vicious. He sent his people. Bombs shook Union offices. Businesses tied to Partin were torched. Dead animals appeared on doorsteps like calling cards from hell. Threats came in waves, anonymous calls in the middle of the night, shadows lurking around the family home. The message was simple. You cost us Hoffa. You're gonna pay. But Marcello didn't stop with revenge. He had political muscles, and he started flexing them. At the same time, another storm was forming. Jim Garrison, the brash district attorney from New Orleans, was turning over stones. He wasn't just going after Ed Partin. He had bigger game in mind, Robert F. Kennedy. But Garrison needed foundation, a place to dig. And Marcello, ever the opportunist, handed him a list, names of CIA-linked operatives floating around Louisiana. Not because he cared about justice, but because he wanted to test their loyalty. The rules were simple. If Garrison leaned on them and they held firm, Marcello let them live. But if they broke under pressure, they were dead men. If they couldn't handle Garrison's questions, they sure as hell wouldn't survive a grilling from Washington or the FBI. Now the fishing expedition began. Garrison's net caught names like Clay Shaw, Guy Bannister, who died in 1964, and David Ferry. 3 men with fingerprints on the edges of American intelligence and its dirtiest secrets. And then a voice surfaced. Perry Russo, a 25-year-old from Baton Rouge, stepped forward. He told reporters that about a month before the Kennedy assassination, David Ferry had told him flat out, "We will get him, and it won't be long." At first, Russo didn't think much of it. Ferry was always shooting off wild theories, invading Cuba, assassinating foreign leaders. But then, after the assassination and Ferry's face started turning up in the press, Russo remembered. He sent a letter to Garrison detailing what he knew. Ferry, he said, had told him more than once that killing Kennedy was not just possible, it was planned. Russo was dragged into the Clay Shaw trial, and his words exploded like dynamite. He testified that in the fall of 1963, in a house on Louisiana Avenue, he overheard David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and a man known as Kllum Bertrand plotting the murder of President Kennedy. On the stand, the defense pounced. They picked apart Russo's testimony, word by word. "Did you contribute anything to the discussion?" "No, I didn't hear a lot, just bits and pieces." "Was there ever any actual agreement to kill the president?" Ferry said, "We will kill him." But when it came to Clay Shaw, the man the prosecution believed used the alias Kllum Bertrand, Russo faltered. He admitted that under pressure, he once told Sergeant Edward O'Donnell during a polygraph interview, "I don't know if Shaw was at that party or not." Russo confessed to the stress, the pressure, the way reporters and lawyers were crawling down his throat. "You told the sergeant, if you had to give a yes or no answer, you'd say no." In essence, yes. He even admitted that during one moment of pressure, he claimed to identify Shaw in court not because of certainty, but because the defense went for the jugular, questioning his faith, his character, until he snapped. Was it a legitimate plot to kill Kennedy? Ferry said wild things. It probably wasn't serious. Russo was unraveling under cross-examination, but one truth stuck. Kllum Bertrand and Clay Shaw. They are the same man. Still, defense attorney F. Irvin Diamond tore into him with surgical precision. "You looked at Shaw through a one-way mirror, and on the courthouse steps said you didn't know him." "That's true. I knew him as Kllum Bertrand, not Clay Shaw." "Now who's splitting hairs?" Diamond snapped. Judge Haggerty had to tell the courtroom to lower their voices. The temperature was rising. Outside the courtroom, Marcello watched all of it. Garrison was poking at old ghosts. Ferry, Shaw, the Civil Air Patrol, the CIA. Some of them would crack. Some would die. But Marcello, he stayed in the shadows, pulling the strings. To him, truth didn't matter. What mattered was who could keep their mouth shut. And Ferry, he was already a dead man walking. It was a trap, and David Ferry walked right into it. Jim Garrison, slick as a knife through silk, promised the world. Immunity. Confidentiality. Protection. He told Ferry everything he wanted to hear, everything a desperate man needed to believe. And Ferry, he was desperate. Bald, trembling, Haunted by past sins and the weight of 1,000 rumors, he sat across from Garrison's men in the shadowy corners of the New Orleans District Attorney's office. He'd been cornered before, but this felt different. This was colder. This was surgical. But this was never about Ferry. This was about Carlos Marcello and the game he played. Ferry was a pawn, dangled on a hook for one reason, to see who'd flinch. Garrison wasn't just investigating the assassination, he was probing loyalties. The deeper he dug, the more it looked like Marcello was letting him. Every question Garrison asked, every subpoena he filed, every odd character dragged out of the Louisiana underworld, it was all part of a calculated campaign to muddy the waters. The price was high: dead witnesses, murdered strippers, connections to Ruby and his Dallas nightclub circuit, all rising to the surface like bloated corpses. But the reward was even greater. Marcello would know who might talk, and he'd have them killed before they ever got near a courtroom. And Ferry? Ferry was just the first to crack. In February of 1967, the Shreveport Journal ran a front-page story that sent tremors through the intelligence community. David Ferry, a jittery ex-pilot and private eye with CIA rumors buzzing around his head like flies, had been re-interviewed by Garrison's men. They had told him, to his face, that they'd positively uncovered a plot in New Orleans to assassinate Kennedy. Ferry didn't know what to make of it. He claimed he had taken a road trip to Texas with 2 friends in November of 1963. Pure coincidence, he said. Just a post-case vacation. Houston, Galveston, then Alexandria. But now Garrison wanted it all again, minute by minute, word by word. Ferry asked to see his old FBI statements. He never got them. He told the press he was innocent. He told them the accusations were ridiculous. He denied ever knowing Oswald. He called the whole thing a big joke. But the laughter never reached his eyes. By now, the pressure was eating him alive. Friends were being questioned. Strangers were asking about him. His old associates were being hauled in. Someone in the DA's office had marked him as the getaway pilot in the president's murder. Then, on February 22nd, 1967, Ferry was found dead in his apartment. He was naked, with a sheet pulled to his chest. Near his body were pills, too many to ignore. A handwritten note was found in the dining room. To leave this life is, for me, a sweet prospect. I find nothing in it that is desirable, and on the other hand, everything that is loathsome. But there was more. The coroner said it was a ruptured blood vessel in the brain. But because of the note and the circumstances, a full autopsy was ordered. Ferry had been suffering from high blood pressure. He'd told friends he had encephalitis and sleeping sickness. He was unraveling. And Jim Garrison. He stepped in front of the microphones like a director stepping onto set. The apparent suicide of David Ferry ends the life of a man who, in my judgment, was one of history's most important individuals. He said Ferry had been under constant surveillance, and that they had just made the decision to arrest him the following week. Apparently we waited too long. There was a blonde kid, unknown, loitering outside the apartment. Police said he found the body, but the kid denied it. Said he didn't know Ferry. Said he just wandered in. Right. Marcello, watching from the shadows, had the answer he wanted. Ferry was too weak. He cracked. He was one more link to Lee Harvey Oswald and New Orleans, a loose thread in a tightly wound conspiracy. The Garrison probe had served its purpose. Now the cleanup will begin. Garrison told the press, with a calm voice and tired eyes, that his investigation was still on course. But the truth was darker. Ferry was dead. Shaw was next. And Marcello? He was still holding the cards. In March of 1964, a man named Thomas Henry Kllum was found lying beside a shattered shop window on a quiet street in Pensacola, Florida, his throat slashed open. The cops said it was an accident. The coroner called it suicide, but his brother wasn't buying either story. Earl Kllum, a car salesman from Florida, had been waiting 2 years for the right moment. Now, in the shadow of a renewed investigation into President Kennedy's assassination, he asked County Solicitor Carl Harper to dig up his brother's body and find out what really happened. Earl said his brother had seen it coming. He'd told him flat out he was being chased by agents, whoever they were. Federal, state, something else. Thomas didn't say. What he did say was that he had to get out of Dallas. It was December 1963. The city was still frozen in the aftermath of Kennedy's murder. Lee Harvey Oswald had been gunned down just days after the assassination by Jack Ruby, whose nightclub, as it turned out, had employed Thomas Kllum's wife, Wanda, as a hostess. Kllum bolted for Florida. Wanda stayed behind. She told reporters later that her husband had been questioned repeatedly by federal agents. He never said who was on his tail, just that he had to leave, fast. In Dallas, Kllum had been working jobs under the table, one of them painting houses with a guy named Jack Carter. Carter had once roomed in the same boarding house as Oswald. According to Earl, it was agents and plotters who drove Thomas out of town. He made it to Pensacola in December, then moved to Tampa. But he came back to Pensacola on March 17th to stay at his mother's place. 2 days later, he was dead. The day he got back, he said something Earl never forgot. "I'm a dead man. I've run as far as I'm going to run." Early that morning, 4 o'clock, Thomas got a phone call at his mother's house. He got dressed, walked out the door, and a car drove off. He didn't own a car. 30 minutes later, street sweepers downtown heard a crash. They turned to find a man stumbling near a shattered window. That man was Thomas Kllum. The family wanted answers. Wanda, who by then was working the floor as a cigarette girl at the theater lounge in Dallas, didn't believe it was suicide. "Number Hank wouldn't do that," she said. She supported Earl's push to have the body exhumed. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Jim Garrison's investigation was heating up in New Orleans, and people who had kept their mouths shut were starting to talk. That included political insiders. One of them was Senator Russell B. Long of Louisiana, a man who didn't speak lightly. The Long family had deep roots in the state's power structure, with old ties to Carlos Marcello and even further back to the days of Silvestro Carollo. Long had sat down with United Press International and said what few in Washington were willing to admit, that Garrison's investigation might not produce convictions, but it could turn up enough evidence to shake the foundation of the Warren Commission. According to Garrison, it was a conversation with Long on a plane to New York in October that pushed him to go public. Long downplayed it, saying Garrison had already been digging months before that. Either way, the senator hadn't briefed the FBI about Garrison's updates. He told UPI that Garrison might have people claiming they'd heard Oswald talk about killing Kennedy before it happened. But the trail was old, cold. Still, it didn't mean it wasn't worth following. "He could make the Warren Commission look pretty bad," Long said. "Or he could end up looking pretty foolish. More than likely, it'll be somewhere in between. He might produce something real that's tough to prove, but a lot of people will say, 'Yeah, that sounds possible.'" Long also revealed that Garrison had arrested a suspect just days after Kennedy was killed, but let him go after the press locked in on Oswald as the lone shooter. Whether that suspect was tied to the current investigation, Long didn't say. What made Long different from the average skeptic was his proximity to the people who signed off on the official story. As Senate Democratic whip, he met weekly with Hale Boggs, Richard Russell, and John Sherman Cooper, all members of the Warren Commission, and he wasn't shy about criticizing its leadership. He called out Chief Justice Earl Warren for not personally reviewing the autopsy photographs. When Senator Robert F. Kennedy placed those photos in the National Archives without even letting the commission see them, Long wasn't having it. If this were a Supreme Court case, and a lower court judge didn't look at the evidence, even though it was right there, Warren would have thrown the whole thing back for retrial, Long said. When people ask how Carlos Marcello got away with the assassination, they usually expect a gun smoking. What they don't understand is that the real power isn't in the trigger, it's in the cover-up. And by the time the Warren Commission got started, Marcello already had one of his own at the table. Not just the obvious players, like former CIA Director Alan Dulles, whose ties to the United Fruit Company and corporate coups went back to the 1950s, when he was working legal deals for them out of Sullivan and Cromwell. Dulles didn't just understand regime change, he engineered it. But the deeper cut, the one people miss, was Hale Boggs. In 1962, Boggs was the U.S. representative for Louisiana's 2nd District and had just been elevated to House Majority Whip. That made him one of the most powerful Democrats in the House, responsible for party discipline, vote counting, and keeping the legislative machine running. He was also one of Carlos Marcello's closest political allies. Boggs didn't just know Marcello. He visited his businesses. They moved in the same circles. They spoke the same language when it came to power. So when Boggs was tapped to sit on the Warren Commission, Marcello had a man on the inside, someone who wouldn't ask the wrong questions. Years later, Boggs vanished. October 16th, 1972. Boggs boarded a twin-engine Cessna 310 in Anchorage, Alaska, heading to a campaign fundraiser with Representative Nick Begich. Also on board were Begich's aide Russell Brown and the pilot Don Johns. It was a routine political trip until it wasn't. Some say it was just an accident, but people familiar with the way the Southern Mafia handled problems knew better. Marcello had deep influence in aviation, access to private hangars, maintenance crews, charter pilots. If he needed to take someone out mid-flight, there'd be no mess, no forensic trail, just a plane that breaks apart in the air and vanishes into the wilderness. That's exactly what happened. The search was massive. Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, civilian helicopters. No wreckage, no bodies, no emergency signal. The plane didn't even have an emergency locator transmitter. Wasn't required yet. And the pilot's personal beacon? It turned up in Fairbanks, in another plane. A witness said they saw a device in his briefcase that looked like the beacon, but it never broadcast a signal. After 39 days, the search was called off. Boggs was declared dead after a 7-minute hearing in front of Judge Dorothy Tyner. No questions, no objections. Richard Russell, another Southern kingmaker, was still in office. A senior senator from Georgia, Russell had chaired major defense committees, steered federal funding across the South, and held enormous sway over judicial appointments. He knew how to move money and people in ways that didn't leave fingerprints. Men like Marcello needed allies like Russell, men who could bury things without a shovel. That's how Carlos Marcello got away with it. It wasn't just about pulling off the hit. It was about locking down the investigation before it ever had a chance to breathe. To him, the message was clear. Garrison was turning up leads the commission had missed, and if there was a conspiracy, then maybe Oswald was just the front man. Maybe the real shooter had gotten away clean. David William Ferry had been on the edge for a long time. He was once a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and after that fell apart, he drifted into freelance investigations, fringe politics, and bad company. When Ferry turned dead in New Orleans in early 1967, it didn't take long for District Attorney Jim Garrison to say what everyone was thinking. He had intended to arrest Ferry. He called the death suicide. The coroner called it natural. But the questions didn't stop. National Archives officials released 24 pages documenting Ferry's history with federal investigators. The file included interviews, tips, conflicting alibis, and one critical statement. Ferry had once said President Kennedy ought to be shot. He told the FBI that it was a figure of speech, a reaction to Kennedy's refusal to provide air cover during the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Ferry admitted to criticizing the president, loudly and often, but insisted he never meant it literally. He denied ever meeting Oswald, denied training anyone on rifles or scopes, denied knowing how to use a telescopic sight, denied owning one. According to his statement, he didn't own a rifle and never taught anyone how to shoot. Ferry also told the FBI he didn't fly Oswald anywhere, ever. He had a single-engine Stinson monoplane, registration 8293K, but it hadn't been airworthy since 1962, when his license expired. He said he'd never flown anyone to Dallas, not Oswald, not anyone. That didn't match what people were saying. Jack Martin, a private investigator in New Orleans with a drinking problem and a big mouth, had told Garrison right after the assassination that Ferry had trained Oswald with a scoped rifle and had traveled to Dallas in the weeks before November 22nd. But when the FBI got to Martin, he recanted, calling the story a drunken fantasy. He told agents he suffered from telephonitis when drinking, and admitted to calling Assistant District Attorney Herman Coleman during a binge, making the whole thing up. Still, Ferry had his own problems. He admitted to being questioned about rumors that he was the getaway pilot in Kennedy's murder. On November 25, 1963, 3 days after the assassination, he was arrested in New Orleans after returning from a road trip to Texas. Ferry claimed he left New Orleans around 9 in the night on November 22nd and drove to Houston and Galveston with 2 companions, Alvin Beauboeuf, a teenager, and Melvin Coffey, in his late 20s. They were in a light blue 1961 Comet station wagon with Louisiana plates. Records showed that the 3 men had registered at a Houston motel on November 23rd and were seen later that night in Galveston. A gas station attendant in Port Arthur, William Frank Powell, remembered 3 men in a light blue Comet stopping for spark plugs. They watched the news for a few minutes. Powell thought it was sometime after Oswald had been shot by Jack Ruby in the Dallas police station. He said the men seemed like they were in a hurry, but couldn't recall which direction they headed. Ferry said they got back to New Orleans around 9:30 p.m. that Sunday. After speaking with his attorney, Ray Gill, Ferry said he drove out to Hammond, Louisiana, and spent the night at Southeastern Louisiana College, where a friend named Thomas Compton was working on a narcotics research project. Ferry returned to New Orleans on Monday afternoon and met with Gill before heading to the district attorney's office for questioning. He also told the FBI that he had taken 2 trips to Guatemala in October 1963, flying commercial on TACA Airlines. The trips, he said, were part of an investigation for Gill's legal practice. On December 10, 1963, Ferry gave a formal statement to the FBI. To the best of my recollection and belief, I have never known Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. Then came Perry Russo. Russo was a 25-year-old life insurance salesman from Baton Rouge who told reporters that Ferry had once said, "We will get him, and it won't be long," a month before the assassination. Russo said he had known Ferry for about 1.5 years, but after making the statement, Russo vanished. No one could find him. He disappeared as quickly as he'd spoken up. Garrison kept digging. Ferry's death didn't stop the investigation. In fact, it only widened the lens. That's when another name surfaced, Loran Hall. A lot of people still cling to the lone gunman theory, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he pulled the trigger without help, without a network. But back in 1963, when witnesses were still alive and the dust hadn't even settled, that idea wasn't front and center. Not in the papers, not in the courts, not even in Jim Garrison's office down in New Orleans. Garrison never bought the lone gunman pitch. It made him look like he had something bigger, and for a while he did. Carlos Marcello was quietly feeding him tips, selective leads, misdirections, nudging the investigation onto paths that made headlines, but never circled back to Marcello himself. It was damage control with a long view. The more the story shifted from Oswald to new suspects, the more room Marcello had to move in the shadows. If the public saw Oswald as an innocent, as a man set up by others, then his connections to people like Guy Bannister or David Ferry wouldn't matter. And Oswald wasn't shouting about plots or missions. He gave the world a single phrase: "I'm just a patsy." In June 1967, the Associated Press ran a 7-month investigation written by Sid Moody and Bernard Gavza. They called it The Lingering Shadow, the Warren Report and its critics. At 20,000 words, it was the longest story the AP ever transmitted. It took hours to send it over the wires. The depth of the piece was meant to match the depth of the conspiracy theories that kept building momentum. Moody went page by page through the 18,000-page Warren Report. Gavza interviewed James Garrison and one of the top 15 attorneys on the commission. He also sat in the National Archives, flipping through files that critics claimed the government had either hidden or ignored. Together, they fact-checked the attacks. Books by Edward J. Epstein, Inquest; Mark Lane, Rush to Judgment; Harold Weisberg, Whitewash. They didn't just read the footnotes, they matched them against the original testimony. Eyewitness accounts were messy. Take the infamous grassy knoll. Epstein claimed that 8 witnesses standing across from it all said the shots came from that direction. In reality, only 4 of them did. 1 couldn't say. 2 said maybe the depository. 1 thought it might have come from one of the buildings on the corner of Elm and Houston. The same kind of confusion existed inside Mark Lane's narrative. He wrote that 22 of 25 witnesses believed the shots came from the knoll. The official records show 9 said knoll, 12 said depository, and 2 said it could have been either. Then there was Lee E. Bowers, perched up in a railroad signal tower behind the knoll. He'd worked there a decade. I know the acoustics. His testimony. The shots came either from near the book depository or the triple underpass. He couldn't be sure. Neither could most people on the ground. Some ran toward the knoll. Some ran toward the overpass. Some ran to the depository. Most were reacting to panic or to the people around them. One deputy summed it up. Everybody was just running around in circles. Police searched the knoll. Nothing. No rifle. No shells. No shooter. Just a puff of smoke and rumors. One officer found a rifle behind boxes on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. It had Oswald's handwriting on the order form. 2 people said they saw a rifle fired from that window. One of them was Howard Brennan. Critics zeroed in on Brennan. They said his eyesight wasn't good, that he couldn't clearly identify Oswald, that he said the shooter was standing when he fired, when the shooter had to have been kneeling. Joseph Ball, one of the commission's lawyers, was quoted by Epstein as being extremely dubious of Brennan's testimony. Ball later denied he ever said that. He said Brennan was never brought to a reenactment, that the quote was fiction. Brennan told the commission he didn't identify Oswald at the lineup that day because he feared retaliation. He admitted that 4 months later he changed his mind. Epstein called that suspicious. The commission didn't rely on Brennan's later certainty, but they didn't disregard his credibility either. Brennan did, after all, say Oswald looked most like the man he saw. Oswald was number 2 in the lineup. Mark Lane didn't stop with the depository. He dragged Jack Ruby into it. He suggested a meeting between Ruby, J.D. Tippett, and Bernard Weissman at Ruby's club on November 14th. Lane cited several witnesses, but Lieutenant George Arnett of the Dallas Police said he couldn't recall whether Ruby even knew Tippett. Ruby's bartender and handyman, Crayford and Armstrong, did say Ruby might have mentioned knowing a Tippett. But it turns out Ruby knew a different one, Gail Tippett, a detective, not J.D. Weissman, denied ever meeting Ruby, denied being in the Carousel Club, said he never sat down with Tippett. His alibi for November 14th? He was selling carpet until 10 in the night. Mrs. Tippett said her husband was a homebody. Lane didn't include their denials in his book. And then there was Loran Hall, the ex-Cuban mercenary. His name appeared in the papers in July, months after the assassination. Hall later told the FBI that he was in Dallas with 2 other men in late September. At first he said Oswald wasn't with them. Then he changed his story. By then, Garrison had already made his case. Sylvia Oddio, an anti-Castro Cuban living in Dallas, said that on September 26th or 27th, 3 men visited her. One was named Leon Oswald. The next day, one of the Cubans called her and said Oswald had talked about assassinating Kennedy. After the shooting, Oddio recognized Oswald's face. So did her sister. But records showed Oswald was already en route to Mexico at that time. The timeline didn't line up. The commission laid out the Oddio story in full. So did Epstein. But only one side acknowledged the gaps in Oddio's timeline. Lane said the government ignored Ruby's ties to Dallas oil men like Lamar Hunt. But the commission did investigate that. Ruby gave a young woman a ride to Hunt's office on November 21st. That was it. She never got the job. Ruby never saw Hunt. Nancy Perrin Rich told the commission about a meeting in 1962, gun running to Cuba, a man with a bulge in his pocket, Jack Ruby allegedly making a deal. She later said one of the men looked like Vito Genovese's son. The FBI tracked down the bartender she named, Dave Cherry. He said Rich was mentally unstable and barred from the club. Another witness, an attorney who represented her on a vagrancy charge, called her stories ridiculous. Lane left that out. Ruby's name kept popping up, through Jeep deals, through Castro contacts, through shadowy introductions. Robert McKeown told the FBI that a man named Rubenstein once called him offering $15,000 to get prisoners out of Cuba. He thought it might have been Jack Ruby. He also said he couldn't be sure. Then there was the theory about the Dallas police car that honked twice outside Oswald's rooming house shortly after the assassination. Housekeeper Erlene Roberts saw it. Lane said police lied about it. Car 207 was there, he said. But the commission traced the car. The officer had left it at the depository just after 12:45 p.m. The keys didn't go back out until 3:30. Lane never explained how someone could have driven it across town, honked outside the house, and disappeared again, all in heavy traffic, with no reason given. And what about the moment Ruby shot Oswald? Critics called it a superplot, said the timing was too perfect. But Ruby's receipt from Western Union was time-stamped at 11:17 a.m. Oswald was shot at 11:21. 4 minutes. That's what separated a mundane wire transfer from a murder that would define a generation. The Warren Commission didn't say, Oswald did it. End of story. What it said was this: there is no evidence that Oswald acted in concert with anyone else. If such evidence exists, it was beyond the reach of all investigative bodies of the United States. That's where the matter rested, at least officially. But not in New Orleans, not in the bookstores, not in the homes of people reading Rush to Judgment or Whitewash, because public opinion doesn't care about footnotes. It runs on suspicion, rumors, and the smell of something deeper just beneath the surface. When Jack Anderson sat down to type, he kept hammering at a part of the story that made mob bosses like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante flinch. Because if Anderson kept pulling at that thread, it would unravel a web that didn't just involve a lone gunman or a rogue agent. It tied into an entire network. Cuban exiles, American mercenaries, right-wing operators, mob fixers. A cast of characters with overlapping loyalties and old debts. Loran Hall was one of those names. A gun for hire, a hustler dressed up in the language of revolution. Back in the early days, he had backed Castro, helped him run weapons, taught his men how to clean, fix and fire them on the battlefield. At one point, Hall probably believed there was a future for him in the new Cuba. But Castro saw him for what he was, a freelance criminal angling for a payoff, and tossed him into a cell. That betrayal hardened Hall. From then on, Castro became the enemy. By 1963, Hall was working his way back into the underworld circuit, this time through organized crime, exile groups, and eventually the Central Intelligence Agency. He knew things, and whatever he told his kids, if he told them, might be the last missing piece in a puzzle the rest of the country gave up trying to solve. Sometime during the last week of September or the first days of October, 3 men knocked on Sylvia Oddio's door. She was a young Cuban woman living with her sister Annie in a Dallas apartment complex called Magellan Circle. Their parents had been locked up in Cuba after plotting against Castro in 1961. Sylvia, a member of Jura, an anti-Castro group made up of ex-revolutionaries, was trying to get out of Dallas with her kids. Instead, trouble came to her doorstep. 2 of the men introduced themselves as Leopoldo and Angelo. They spoke Spanish and claimed to know her father. The third didn't say much. He was American, slim, quiet, introduced only as Leon. They asked her to help write letters to Dallas donors, maybe raise some money for the cause. She kept it polite, but didn't offer anything. They left. A day or 2 later, Leopoldo called. It sounded like a mix of political talk and a personal move. He asked what she thought of the American. Said the guy was a little unhinged, former Marine, great shot, maybe capable of anything. He told her Leon had joked that Kennedy should have been shot after the Bay of Pigs. Sylvia kept quiet about the conversation, but a few weeks later, after the assassination, she saw Oswald's picture and froze. Leon was Lee Harvey Oswald. She called the FBI. They sat on it for 6 months. The Oddio story never went away. The Warren Commission knew it was radioactive. So did the House Select Committee in the late 70s. Both considered Sylvia Oddio a credible witness. But it took 4 decades and the declassification of millions of documents to trace who her visitors were and what it meant. The best guess now? It was Loran Hall, his associate Lawrence Howard, and Oswald himself. Hall, a decorated veteran and professional mercenary, had once fought alongside Castro. After his arrest and a few months in a Cuban jail, he came back bitter and wired into people like Traficante, who had also been locked up in Cuba. Ruby had visited Traficante during that time at the Trescornia detention camp outside Havana. One visitor, one moment, tied together 3 of the most critical names in the Kennedy investigation. By the summer of 1963, Hall and Howard were moving a truckload of arms from California to Florida. Hall was giving speeches to right-wing groups, collecting cash. His name came up in old assassination plots against Castro. One in particular, the Bayo Pauli raid, fell apart just months before. He wasn't just moving guns. He was moving people, planning hits, and looking for the right trigger man. That fall, John Martino was in Dallas too. Mobbed up. Former casino man in Havana. Had done 3 years in Castro's jails trying to smuggle cash off the island. He was the fixer who helped organize the failed Bayo Pauli raid and had the ears of both Traficante and the exiles. On October 27th, just weeks before the assassination, Martino made another stop in Dallas. Days later, watching Kennedy's Texas tour on TV, he muttered to his family, "If he goes to Dallas, they're going to kill him." After the murder, Martino helped shape the narrative, pushing Oswald as a Castro pawn, feeding the story to anti-communist outlets. It was a setup, one that turned Kennedy's death into an excuse for war. The CIA was behind the assassination. It had opened the back door to men who were more than willing to help. Starting in 1960, the agency had cut deals with mobsters to kill Castro, Giancana, Roselli, trafficante. Marcello was in the mix too. The plan was run through Robert Maheu, a private eye who worked clean for the agency. The game was sabotage, propaganda, and murder. The Kennedy White House knew parts of it. Some of it they encouraged. Other parts, like Roselli's secret missions, weren't meant for daylight. By the time Oswald tried to get into Cuba through Mexico City, he was following a script that had already been written. He wanted to go in. The Cuban embassy saw through him, called it a setup, and denied his visa. He came back to Dallas empty-handed, and soon after took the job. Oswald was 24, a Marine dropout, a Soviet defector, and a political shapeshifter. His history screamed leftist, but his actions told a different story. He embarrassed the very groups he claimed to support. His work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans smelled more like a trap than a cause. He looked like someone designed to discredit the left, not represent it. Marcello, Trafficante, Giancana, they all had reasons to want Kennedy gone. The pressure from Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department was non-stop. Indictments, deportations, phone taps, surveillance. The noose was tightening. Jimmy Hoffa felt it too. He passed a message through his lawyer, Frank Regano, to the bosses. It was time to pull the trigger. The hit wasn't random. It was payback. Robert Kennedy had declared war on the underworld, and his brother paid the price. The fallout worked exactly as planned. Bobby was out of office within the year. The heat died down. The Mafia went back to business. Jack Ruby was the cleanup man. He was friendly with mob figures in Chicago, Tampa, and New Orleans. He ran a strip club in Dallas, had ties to Trafficante's network through Louis McWillie, and was in direct contact with Chicago boys through long-distance calls in the months before the hit. In 1959, Ruby had been in Havana, poking around casino circles, trying to find his angle in the Cuban arms trade. He showed up in Trescornia right as Trafficante was being held. They were both on the inside, and Ruby didn't leave empty-handed. Ruby made more than one trip. He was in and out of Cuba that summer, flying through Miami and New Orleans, slipping through the cracks. He used his safe deposit box when he needed to. Met with FBI agent Charles Flynn 8 times. Never gave up anything useful. Didn't talk Cuba, didn't talk arms, just played it dumb. McKeown, the arms dealer out of Seabrook, Texas, confirmed the contact. Said Ruby offered him 15 grand to help get some prisoners out of Castro's jails. Later, Ruby tried to sell jeeps to the regime. Deals never happened. But the phone calls, the meetings, the promises, they left a paper trail. Ruby was up to something. Maybe it was arms. Maybe it was money. Maybe it was just the score he'd been chasing his whole life. Ruby's name was also attached to the Campisi brothers, mobbed-up restaurateurs out of Dallas. McKeown didn't know them personally, but he said Carlos Prio, the former Cuban president, told him they were good for the cause. That cause depended on arms, planes, contacts, and sometimes guys like Ruby. This is where I'll end the teaser for this documentary. But before I go, I want to thank every single one of you for your support. When I started this channel, I never imagined we'd get to this point so quickly. In those first few documentaries, I just wanted to talk about the history of corruption and organized crime, and how that history still affects the world we live in today. I set out to understand where corruption begins. It's always been part of our story. From the British, French, and Italian empires to the rise of America. A country built by immigrants, by native peoples, by hope and hardship, by light and darkness. America became a beacon, but also a battlefield. And at the heart of that battle was corruption. It didn't just grow, it evolved. It became an art form during Prohibition. That's where I started, at the foundation, with Charles Lucky Luciano, a man with vision. He saw what society didn't, that if you ignore the immigrants, the hungry, the desperate, they'll create their own systems of power. Luciano came from poverty, but he understood opportunity. The world around him was already corrupt. He just learned how to bend it. Through Luciano, I talked about how the mafia embedded itself in government. With Frank Costello, I explored how these men didn't just touch politics. They controlled it. They shook hands with presidents: Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Richard Nixon, even Joseph Kennedy. These weren't footnotes in history. They were architects. With Meyer Lansky, I broke down the evolution of laundering and offshore power, how Vegas was built, how entire islands were created as financial sanctuaries. They took illegal money, cleaned it, and reinvested it right back into the American economy. They mastered capitalism through crime. Next, I'll take you through Carlo Gambino's rise, the quiet conqueror who made Luciano's vision his own. Then we moved to Chicago, where Tony Accardo built an empire so strong that he never spent a single day behind bars. Alongside him were men like Paul Ricca and others who shaped the outfit's reach across the Midwest, California, and beyond. We'll talk about Santo Trafficante in Florida, the definition of mafia royalty. A father handing his empire to his son, who ruled until his last breath. No challenges, no coups. Just absolute power, generation to generation. And then there's Carlos Marcello, the kingpin of the South, a ruthless force who built one of the most powerful and overlooked criminal syndicates in American history. A shadow empire, never given the spotlight it truly deserved. We all love history. We all love the stories of organized crime. But what matters most is understanding how these stories still shape the world we live in now. These men were rich and powerful, but their influence was just the beginning. Today, the names have changed: Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. But the structure remains. These are modern-day syndicates. They don't hide their power. They flaunt it. They influence policy, redirect trillions of taxpayer dollars to defense contractors, and wash the profits back into their own hands. They've surpassed the old mafia in wealth, in reach, and in control. America had a shot at being something more. But empires don't collapse from the outside. They rot from within. And until we face the truth about where we come from and how we got here, we'll never understand who the real enemies are, or what it takes to stand up to them. As the 1980s rolled in, the old guard began to fade. The traditional mafia, the one built on blood oaths and street loyalty, was giving way to something bigger, something quieter. A new kind of syndicate was taking shape, one that moved through Capitol Hill, through boardrooms, through the Reagan administration, and later, through the White House offices of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. This was the new mafia: multinational corporations, political influence, and bought elections. The kind of power that didn't need guns in the street. It had contracts, lobbying firms, and offshore accounts. The Central Intelligence Agency wasn't just running foreign operations anymore. By the 1980s, it had its grip on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Politicians, foreign dignitaries, entire governments, if they weren't on the payroll, they were being replaced. In 1980, journalist Jack Anderson, one of the last true investigative reporters, published one of his final pieces on Carlos Marcello. He called it like it was a man whose power had once reached the highest levels, now slipping into decline. But Anderson knew the truth. Marcello hadn't vanished. He was being replaced. Not by rivals with guns, but by men in suits, holding government contracts and lobbying portfolios. This is where I'll say goodbye, for now. But there's more coming. Thank you all for watching and for riding with me on this journey. We're just getting started. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's undercover operation recently caught an assortment of lesser-known congressmen and political figures on tape, conniving with itchy fingers. But the most startling catch of all was a 70-year-old grandfather from a quiet New Orleans suburb. He was identified as Carlos Marcello, sometimes called the Little Man, because of his 5'2" height. It is not a nickname that is used in his presence. Oh, no, one of his associates assured me. Everyone calls him Mr. Marcello, for he is the biggest little man in organized crime. For years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been thwarted in attempts to plant wiretaps or develop informants near Marcello. Except for a 1968 assault charge for slugging a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent 2 years earlier, the Bureau had been unable to make a case against him. Then a shady, twice-convicted businessman named Joe Hauser, who had dealt with Marcello and gained his trust, agreed to set up the mobster for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in return for a reduced prison term. Marcello was recorded on hidden microphones, arranging to bribe Louisiana officials in an attempt to swing a state insurance deal with a rake-off of millions. Now indicted, he has pleaded innocent and awaits trial. It should be one of the most memorable court dramas of our time, for Justice Department files portray Marcello as the brutal boss of a $2 billion criminal empire that underlies Louisiana and penetrates deep into the heart of Texas. Among the godfathers who direct organized crime in America, Marcello is the elder statesman whose advice is sought and heeded. His operation has been described as the most lucrative in the crime business. Yet he has been so skillful at veiling his activities that even his origins are a mystery. Organized crime specialists believe, but they are not really sure, that he was born on February 6, 1910, as Calogero Minacor of Sicilian parents in Tunisia, North Africa, and was brought to New Orleans as an infant. Thereafter, his private life has been shadowy and his dealings secretive. Still, after months of investigation, I have been able to piece together an intimate portrait of the nation's #1 mobster. He declined, of course, to be interviewed, but here is a profile. He is moon-faced and barrel-chested, his massive bulk too big for his short stature. He disdains the gaudy clothes and flashy jewelry one associates with mobsters. He has a rumpled look, his paunchy frame defying the tailor's art. The years have thinned his hair and softened his features. Still, there is a wariness of eye, a slight twist to his nose, a tight-lipped mouth which belie his grandfatherly image and remind visitors of his violent past. Intimates say the face, with its pleasant crinkles, can freeze in a way that will chill the blood of anyone who crosses him. There is nothing ostentatious about the little man. He lives quietly with his wife Jacqueline in a comfortable but not extravagant 3-bedroom house at 3908 Clifford Drive in the New Orleans suburb of Metairie. Remarkably, it is located on an exposed corner lot, easily accessible to passers-by. No high stone walls or electrified fences surround the premises. No security alarms, watchdogs, or armed guards protect the property. He is usually out of bed early. After breakfast, prepared by his confidant, cook and aide, Donald Stone, he may pause to listen to the early news on radio before driving himself, unaccompanied, to the office in either a Lincoln or a Cadillac. The headquarters of his multi-billion-dollar domain is a modest 5-room office near a shopping complex. The outer rooms resemble a real estate office, with maps of his properties on display. Not shown are the thousands of additional acres and scores of enterprises concealed in the names of his 6 younger brothers. Hidden even deeper are the illegal operations: gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and other criminal undertakings, with an estimated rake-off of $2 billion a year, that Marcello allegedly oversees. For lunch, Marcello usually drops by the restaurant next door, where some of his brothers may join him. He favors spicy Louisiana seafood dishes, despite chronic bouts of gout, but limits his drinking to a bottle of beer or a glass of wine. Occasionally, he will entertain luncheon guests at his 5,000-acre Churchill Farms plantation in the Bayou country outside New Orleans. The secluded mansion there has also served as the scene of secretive underworld dealings, according to informants. Sometimes Marcello will stay in town for dinner at one of the 4 or 5 New Orleans restaurants he owns, but most often he makes his way home around 5:30 in the afternoon for a meal cooked by his wife. He is usually in bed by 10 in the evening. The Marcellos seldom entertain, except for family affairs. His brothers are his only intimate friends. By all accounts, he is a good husband to Jacqueline, who is described as an all-in-the-family, church-going mother of their 4 children, Joseph, Louise, Florence, and Jacqueline. But the old godfather's favourite companions are his grandchildren. Several years ago, he took all 11 to Washington to tour the capital while he dealt with his perennial immigration problem. But this doting grandfather, according to sworn testimony before the New Orleans Crime Commission, has corrupted public officials at every level, including police, sheriffs, justices of the peace, prosecutors, mayors, governors, judges, councilmen, licensing authorities, state legislators, and at least 1 member of Congress. When Marcello was convicted for taking a swing at a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent 14 years ago, more than 40 prominent Louisianans wrote letters attesting to his good character. Marcello has played a game of hide-and-seek with the United States legal system for 50 years. In 1930, he was convicted of assault and robbery of a grocery store and was sentenced to a 9 to 14-year prison term. But with the help of unseen friends in high places, he obtained an early pardon from then Louisiana Governor O.K. Allen. Subsequent assault and robbery charges were not even prosecuted. Federal authorities, less impressed with Marcello's political connections, nailed the young hoodlum in 1938 for narcotics peddling. But he was sprung in less than a year and paid a scant fine of $400 by pleading poverty. Twice he has escaped imprisonment on legal technicalities for contempt of Congress after sullenly refusing to respond to questions at crime hearings. His lawyers have also thwarted the government's efforts to expel him. In 1961, he was dragged aboard a plane by immigration agents and shipped to Guatemala, but he sneaked right back into the country. Marcello was acquitted on charges of having falsified his birth records, but, as an aftermath, was indicted on charges of having bribed a member of the jury and having issued a murder contract on the government's chief witness. The latter count was dropped when the witness nervously declined to testify. Marcello was also acquitted on the bribery count. Marcello's mystique within the Mafia is attributed in part to the history of the New Orleans mob. An excerpt from secret Federal Bureau of Investigation files relates that the first family of what has now become known as La Cosa Nostra came from Sicily and settled in New Orleans in the 1880s. Inasmuch as this family was the predecessor of all subsequent families, it has been afforded the highest respect and esteem and the power to make decisions on its own. A Federal Bureau of Investigation investigator has confirmed that Marcello holds a unique independence from the octopus-like control of the crime syndicate's all-powerful commission. The source explained that the commission would not question Marcello about making new members. He was not subject to the necessity of clearing such things with the commission, like the other families were. Marcello's branch of the National Crime Network is also known as the Wall Street of the Cosa Nostra. His treasury is reportedly open to other mob chiefs to finance their secret enterprises. Internal revenue agents suspect that Marcello pays taxes on only a fraction of his enormous cash flow. Yet for years, the crime tycoon pretended to be a tomato salesman plugging along on $1,600 a month. He has now dropped this pretense and passes himself off as an investor and land developer, with declared assets of about $100 million. Over the years, Marcello has pleaded injured innocence to the charges that he has crime connections. In 1959, he insisted petulantly at a Senate hearing, "I am not in no racket. I am not in no organized crime." In late 1975, he had his attorneys seek to suspend federal deportation on the grounds of good moral character. Just a few months ago, A handwritten letter from Marcello arrived at the desk of Hugh Brian, Assistant Commissioner for Detention and Deportation. "I am sure my name is not unknown to you," it began. "I have a family which includes 11 grandchildren, of which my adopted country can be proud. Have a number of businesses of which I and the community are very proud, and I have been a good taxpayer for a number of years. I am at a stage of life where it is tormenting to me to be under this supervision. I would like to spend the rest of my days with a clear head and mind, knowing that I have proved myself to my adopted homeland. I beg of you, and those who are concerned with lifting this darkness from my head and heart, to please consider my request for its removal." It was a request the federal authorities decided they could refuse.